here at the table or virtually regarding the format for today? Technical questions? Seeing none and seeing no hands on my screen, time that we go ahead and get started with our agenda. First item on today's agenda is an ecosystems approach to fisheries management, recreational summer flounder strategy evaluation update. Brandon Muffley with council staff will be giving us that presentation. And Brandon, are you there?
I'm here, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Whenever you're ready, we can go ahead and get started.
Awesome. Thank you very much, and good morning, council and board, and thanks for the opportunity. I know you have a busy day today, so hopefully I will be brief and keep you guys on track. Today's really just an update for you all to give you a sense of what's been going on with the management strategy evaluation project since your August meeting, when we presented a whole suite of information and materials. So I'm just going to cover sort of what's been going on primarily since that August meeting, and then where we're going with the project. So just a quick, review of the background, just to give you, some context for the presentation today. If you remember, this management strategy evaluation is part of the council's continued development and implementation of our EAFM guidance document. So that's why you are listening to me talk about summer flounder instead of Kylie, because this is part of our EAFM process. And I had promised the last time I wouldn't show our structured decision framework figure that I always show every time I do an EAFM discussion, so I don't have it there, but I did put it into words just to remind you that that this management strategy evaluation came about through a very deliberative process that council took. And through the risk assessment, we identified summer flounder as our priority species. Through conceptual model development, we decided to focus on recreational discards. And so this didn't come out of the air. This has been a very long and deliberative process that the council has taken to get us to this project. And just a quick reminder of what our goals are for the management strategy evaluation, which are to evaluate the biological and economic benefits of minimizing the recreational discards, both live and dead, and converting them to landings, and then identify management strategies to realize those benefits. And so a management strategy evaluation is a perfect way to go about evaluating these different management strategies and understanding how different management strategies may help us achieve these different goals that we have. And so we can look across different strategies, evaluate the trade-offs between one set of alternatives versus another set. And we can do that all before we implement anything. So if if a particular management strategy does not produce something that we want or causes overfishing to happen, we didn't implement anything. We're just doing this through simulation models to evaluate what those implications may mean. So it's a really unique tool to allow us to look at all of these different factors across all of our alternatives and see how they meet our different objectives for this project. And a key component of our management strategy evaluation process is a really inclusive stakeholder process to help the council and board identify the objectives and strategies throughout this project. So we started with a lot of broad scoping earlier this year, and now we're down into a very refined approach with stakeholders, which leads me to our core stakeholder group. I don't plan to go into details here. I provided all of the details on our core stakeholder group back in August, but just to remind you that we do have this group. It's 13 people representing all of the different regions of the summer flounder fishery, representing a variety of stakeholder types, primarily within the recreational sector, given the focus of the management strategy evaluation. And so this group of 13 individuals is our main source of input to the technical work group and to you all in regards to sort of what we should be thinking about, what are our alternatives, what are our objectives, and presenting that information to you in the technical work group for further refinement. And so this group, we've put a lot on them, and we have a lot more work to get from them over the next 6 or 7 months or so. And so they've done a great job so far. And so it's been really nice to get this group together to work through some of these projects. And again, there's a lot more information about the entire project up on our website, in particular in regards to how this core stakeholder group was formed and who sits on the group. And just a quick refresher of, we held our first core stakeholder group workshop over the summer, over 2 different sessions. And certainly part of it was to introduce the group to different components of management strategy evaluation and how we are going to proceed through this project. But the major focus during those first workshops was really to develop this consensus decision statement, which really helped sort of set the stage of what the focus of this management strategy evaluation was going to be. Sort of identify all of those different areas of focus and what the expected outcomes would be, so that the entire group had a similar understanding of what our focus for this project would be. And once we had that decision statement out of the way, we could then develop draft management objectives and a range of different alternatives and strategies. And so all of that information was presented to you in August. You reviewed it and approved that range. And again, those management objectives and the alternatives developed at that point in time were really just to capture the overall scope and range of potential considerations, just to make sure we had everything there that we might want to consider. We won't be able to evaluate everything that we came up with originally because we either don't have the data, it may not be a high enough priority, we just won't have the time to evaluate all of these different things. And so the understanding was, when you approve that range of alternatives and objectives back then, that it would go through further refinement and prioritization. Which leads us to what the focus of workshop number 2 was. So we held a 2-day workshop with the core stakeholder group on November 8th and 9th over webinar. We had the group of folks in front of their computer screens for a long period of time over those 2 days. And again, their primary focus was refining and clarifying, condensing, and taking all of those objectives, sub-objectives, metrics, and alternatives, and sort of creating a more focused list of things that the modeling group will then, consider as we continue to move forward. But I also want to emphasize sort of another real key focus of these workshops, this workshop and our future workshops as well, is this emphasis on communication and understanding between the core group and the technical work group. Right, so we're presenting all of these sort of modeling concepts, what our different models can do, the sort of outputs they can produce, which helps then the core group understand and develop, sort of input and feedback that they can offer to the technical work group, which the technical work group can then take that information, build that into its next round of modeling approaches. We can then present those results back to the core group for their feedback and additional prioritization and direction. And the modeling group goes back and works on finalizing the model approaches and the model outputs. So it's this really interactive sort of discussion to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of what the models can and can't do, what they can produce and what they can't produce, and then getting the direction from the core group in terms of the types of things we should be considering and prioritizing when we do our models. And hopefully, this process will create, some support and agreement by everybody that's gone through the process and what those outcomes may mean. That doesn't mean everybody's going to agree what maybe the decisions made at the end of this will be, but they support the process and how this sort of collaborative work went through and how we came up with the different alternatives that we ended up evaluating. And so some of the outcomes from this core workshop, again, the large portion of the focus was on these management objectives, sub-objectives, and metrics. So if you recall back in August, there were 5 different broad objectives for the project, and we had nearly 40 different sub-objectives and metrics associated with those sub-objectives. So there was a lot there to consider. And so the core group sort of talked through all of those different objectives and sub-objectives to think about what was most critical, or what was the core considerations that we would want to evaluate. Or could there be different sub-objectives that could be merged, or could we evaluate different objectives through one specific metric? And so what were those metrics that are most informative? And I'm going to step through just a little bit of some examples of what the group came out with. And here is one of them on the screen in regards to these broader objectives. So we condensed the original 5 objectives into 4 broad objectives. And so when you think about all of the different economic sustainability metrics and sub-objectives that we were thinking about through this project, they really also include that objective in number 5, sustainability of participation. Some of the metrics that we're looking at under this socioeconomic sustainability is the amount of fishing effort and an angler's willingness to pay for a particular trip. So certainly the amount of trips that someone's going to take, it gets to what participation might be. And then angler's willingness to pay for a particular trip certainly gets at participation. And the combination of willingness to pay and the amount of trips that we take sort of gets at all of those economic sustainabilities and other businesses and their willingness to participate in this fishery. So some of those downstream businesses like bait and tackle shops and boat rentals that we're going to be able to evaluate through this process. So that was just more efficient to sort of combine and link, get rid of that sustainability of participation and realize that it could be accomplished through goal number 4. We also then reduced a number of the sub-objectives, and I'm going to give one example here. And so this is through the equity of our angler experience goal that we have. So that's our broad goal, is to maximize the equity between anglers. And I won't go through all of these here. So we have these different sub-objectives associated with that. And I'm going to focus on the left-hand side of the screen here. And so one of the sub-objectives is for anglers to be able to retain a legal size catch, right? That's one of the goals is, for each, sector, for each state or for each region is to maximize our ability for anglers to take home at least one summer flounder during a trip. So that's a potential goal that we may have. And so different metrics that we're going to look at there is our change in the percent chance. So again, equity does not necessarily mean, equal opportunities across, but can we keep things equitable between the states or between the regions or between sectors? And so we're going to look at sort of these percent change and the chance of retaining a particular, retaining a summer flounder on a particular trip. And so if we change a regulation and one sector's ability to retain a fish changes much greater than a different sector, or one state's ability to retain a summer flounder changes much more than another state, we're going to have the ability to evaluate what those relative changes are between states and between modes. And we'll look at the percent differences in terms of how those things are changing. And another factor that we'll look at, or another sub-objective, is the retention rate, right? So we hear a lot about, you have to catch 10, 15, 20 different summer flounder before you are able to catch that one keeper summer flounder. And so we're going to look at those retention rates. How many, look at the ratio between landings and discards and see how those ratios change between sectors, between states as we modify different regulations. So those are just some examples of the sub-objectives that we can look at, and then the metrics that we'll utilize to evaluate how those things are changing depending upon the regulation changes that we may implement. Then we also spent quite a bit of time looking at alternatives and strategies. If you recall, back in August, there were 15 different alternative categories that we had, and there were over 80 different options. And those aren't even combinations of options. Those are just 80 different unique options within these 15 different categories. And so clearly we need to begin to sort of refine that list, get it down to some priorities. And so again, so the core stakeholder group really focused on those with the greatest impact in terms of what may happen out on the water and what we could appropriately model, either directly or through some proxy information. So obviously we focused on size, season, and possession limit. Those are clearly areas that we all, have interest in and an understanding in, and we can certainly model and have information about those. We also talked about enforcement and compliance, and so how compliance rates may change depending upon different regulatory schemes. how discard mortality rate may change under different components, different gear regulations, or under different education systems. So understanding how changes in discard mortality may impact our trade-offs between strategies and how they, achieve our different objectives. And our fourth workshop is going to be a 2-day workshop. Hopefully we're going to meet in person. We don't have dates yet, but it's going to be likely in late April, early May, where we'll review the draft final outputs and those implications, finalize our objectives, trade-offs, and make any recommendations to you all for management consideration. Just a quick overview of the modeling work. I'm not going to go into any of these details about the models themselves, but just to give you a sense of the 2 different models that our technical work group is currently developing. One is an operating or a biological model. Again, this is not a stock assessment model, this biological model, but it is conditioned with a lot of the stock assessment inputs. And then I'll show that on the next slide. So a lot of our catch information that comes from the stock assessment and our life history information, our different fishing fleets that are aligned in the stock assessment are going to be part of this biological model. But this model is more to simulate summer flounder population dynamics, right? So given different recruitment scenarios or, and different population dynamics, what is going on within the summer flounder population that can then feed into our bioeconomic model. And so our biological model has the ability to consider spatial differences, sex-specific dynamics, and look at biological uncertainties. And so we can look at potentially, if summer flounder productivity increases or decreases in the future, we can evaluate how our management strategies work under those different scenarios, right? So maybe a management strategy works well only when summer flounder productivity is really good, right? We're having good year classes come through the system every couple of years. But if we have a time period of low productivity, maybe those same management measures don't work as well. And so we'll be able to evaluate that through this process. Then we have an implementation or a bioeconomic model. And so this bioeconomic model has 2 different components. It has a behavioral model, which looks at angler preferences and what, and those drivers of fishing effort, what makes an angler decide to take a fishing trip on that particular day or not, given the different management measures that are in place. And so then it can simulate, through the simulation model, it can predict those impacts of angler behavior, welfare, and fishing mortality. So it can look at the likelihood that a fisherman's going to take a particular trip. It's going to then develop, the opportunities to then what harvest might look like or catch might look like under different management measures. And this economic model also has the ability to look at interactions between different fisheries. So right now, black sea bass is built into the model as well. So we can look at what those dynamics are. If the black sea bass fishery is open, but summer flounder is closed, what are those impacts on recreational discards in the summer flounder fishery? And these models or components of them have been built off of other projects or for other species, and they've gone through extensive peer review. Certainly they are being reworked and tooled specifically for this management strategy evaluation, but they are models that have been used in other fisheries around the world and for other projects. So we're not starting from scratch with these models. And here I won't spend a whole lot of time, but this is the model, the management strategy evaluation, the simulation model framework. And so this is where the 2 models sort of link together, and there are other pieces of information that go through it. And so there's this whole sort of simulation loop that's taking place. So we have this operating model that's looking at our population dynamics. Again, it's taking information from our stock assessment, our age and sex structure. It's looking at our size composition, the numbers of fish at length. Again, we're going to have the commercial removals are part of this operating model. Plus, we'll have all of the other sort of, population dynamic information, right? Looking at survey indices, looking at recruitment information, all of that information is going into the operating model. And we will utilize again, we're not running a stock assessment here, but we will use stock assessment information like our existing reference points, our existing, ABCs and ACLs and the recreational harvest limit that comes from the stock assessment. We'll utilize that information within this simulation model framework. The operating model will produce numbers of fish at length that go into the implementation model or the bioeconomic model. Then depending upon what the management measures are, and the management measures are being set by this core stakeholder group, right? They're helping us identify what are our size limits. Should we be looking at slot limits? What should bag limits be looking like? That's where the core group fits in. So they're helping us specify what those management procedures should be. Whatever the management procedure is, that gets fed into the economic model. The economic model determines what the total catch at length is under that particular regulation might be. And so, and then that population information then goes back into the operating model. It has what those removals are from the recreational fishery. It then reruns its population information, and you just have this continual cycle of what the population is given recreational and commercial removals under certain management structures, what those removals look like, and then feeds back into the population. So you have this, continual loop of evaluating the population compared to these different recreational regulations. So we can get a whole series of performance metrics out of this, looking at angler, metrics in terms of number of trips, the angler welfare out of that. We can get economic metrics that come out of that, and all of our suite of biological metrics. What's what's spawning stock biomass look like compared to our reference points? What does fishing mortality rate look like compared to our reference points? So we can evaluate all of those things through this simulation model. So the next steps, again, the focus now is on the modeling work in preparation for workshop number 3. So the technical work group, we actually just met yesterday, taking all of the outcomes and feedback from that workshop. They have created an initial list of scenarios that we're going to begin modeling so that we can demonstrate what the models can do, what sort of outputs the models can produce, and we'll show those to the core group at workshop number 3. So that's sort of our next focus over the next couple of months. We didn't need to make some slight adjustments to the activities and the timeline. Like I said, we added a core stakeholder group workshop. Our workshops have been really successful. They've been great. The folks have been really engaged, but meeting over webinar, as you all know, is not as effective at times versus being able to meet in person. And so we really, in order to get all of the feedback that we want, we need to add another workshop in with our core stakeholder group. And we need some additional time for model development. It's taken a little bit of time to link up the two models to make sure that they're speaking in the same currency and are able to communicate data back and forth to one another. So some of those delays have kind of pushed us back a little bit, but only about a month. We're not too far behind, and this still, it doesn't push back sort of the council and the board's ability to utilize this information for setting measures in potentially 2023. And so we're still on time there. We're just sort of, the ending date is pushed back a little bit further, but the actual utilization by the council and board is not pushed back at all. And this is just a detailed sort of timeline. I won't go through it. Everything in orange is the things that we've completed. Again, we've gone from a lot of this broad scoping and getting feedback to refining what those things should be. Now we're into the modeling phase of things. And so that's where we're going to be focusing now, is what are the model results telling us? Where do we need to continue to keep focusing those particular efforts? And again, today was just an update for you all. There's no specific decisions, just to give you a sense of where we are and where we're going with the project. Certainly, I'll take any feedback that you all may have on what we're doing and where we're going with this. And again, I just, if you want any more information regarding the project, it's all up on our website. There's a whole page specifically dedicated to the management strategy evaluation project, and I try to keep that updated as best as I can with Mary in terms of putting additional information up there. And so with that, Mr. Chair, I'll take any questions.
All right, thank you, Brandon, for your presentation, and thanks to all of those individuals who have contributed to this project over the course of time. Let me look around and see if anybody has questions they'd like to ask of Brandon at this time. Adam Nowalski.
Very much. Thank you, Brandon, for the presentation. As a member of the core working group, not as a stakeholder, but the working group that we have been a part of the process. One of the topics that came up during one of the core working group, and I believe was touched on with the stakeholders, was the impacts of certain commercial fishing activities that may be impacting the selectivity that's available for the recreational fishing community during their season. The Science Center, I believe, indicated they may have some data to support that during that time. You and I had some offline conversations about it. I'm wondering if there's anything the council needs to be at this point to further that data request, and can it still be incorporated in the modeling work that's ongoing?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. Yeah, you and I have had some discussions about this. I don't think there's anything specifically additional that's required from the council and board at this time. Again, that operating model is going to have the commercial fleet in it. It's going to actually have the commercial landings and the commercial discards, and it's going to have those by length, broken down by length. So we're going to be able to evaluate those components within the operating model. And so we'll have, based off of what the different, we haven't specified yet within the modeling subgroup what the different time steps might be. Obviously, we're going to evaluate this at an annual time step, but you can look at different things within the year. Do we want to look at how length frequency may change in the first quarter of the year, for example, right? Which is to your question, which is when a lot of commercial fishing operations take place, and it's generally before most of the recreational fishing begins to take place. And so I think we will have the ability to evaluate what length frequency will look like for the recreational sector prior to them being, prior to them starting their fishing activities. So we're going to have, I think we're going to have the ability to sort of evaluate what those implications may be and what length frequency is going to be available for the recreational sector before we begin to implement what those actual management measures are. So I think there is an opportunity to do that in this project.
Adam? And I just want to make clear, this is not a request or concern here about the commercial fishing activity. This is about being fully informed in the recreational selectivity process for what's available to us. We need to know that there's going to be different fish available at different times, and that's what I'm interested in when we got this information, and look forward to using that information.
All right, thanks, Adam. Bob Beal. Okay, anybody else from the council have any questions for Brandon? Or the board, I'm sorry. Seeing none, is there anyone from the public in attendance with us today who has any questions? Like Jim Fletcher? Go ahead, Jim.
My question is, do any of the models run a total retention where nothing is thrown back? I have pushed for a total length and no discards. I am now pushing for a size hook below which it will not retain a fish. But do any of the models that you have run, or has any of the discussion been of a total retention by the recreational fishermen based on length? No slot sizes, no maximum size, just total retention. And if they want a bigger fish, all they need to do is, can the model run what size hook will produce what size fish in a 90 or 95% time? Can the models do that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, James. So the models can evaluate a total length, scenario. They can evaluate slot limits, and the core group has talked about the total retention, or a cumulative length approach. You know, and it was carried forward until our last workshop, and the core group really has not expressed, you know, interest in sort of pursuing that. We've considered it, you know, slot limits is still sort of on the table, or at least like a one fish at a smaller size and some at a lower possession limit, and then fish at a greater size, you know, at a higher size limit with, you know, with a different possession limit. So we are looking at some of those, but the full retention has not been something that the core group has indicated that they wanted to pursue. But the models can model that.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. Thanks for your question, James. Anyone else from the public have any questions they'd like to ask at this time? Seeing none at this time. Brandon, thank you for the work on this project, and we'll look forward to continued updates in 2022. Thanks again for being with us today.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, the next item on our agenda, we're going to take up the 2022 Summer Flounder recreational measures. But before we jump into that, Bob Beal would like to make an announcement. Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to follow Dr. Moore's lead and staff member. Savannah Lewis is in the back of the room, and Savannah's been here or been online with you guys many, many times. But unfortunately, don't get too used to seeing Savannah. Her husband's in the Air Force and is Hawaii, so she's made the difficult decision not to stay around Arlington, Virginia. You know, move to Hawaii. Apparently, the climate's better there. So Savannah's here. I just want to introduce her and let you know she is here, but we'll be quickly moving on.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. And Savannah worked for the agency that I worked for a while, so we lost her there after you guys stole her from us, and now she's on her way out to Hawaii. So thanks for all your work, Savannah, and best of luck to you when you know, after your move. It's been great having you around. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kylie. We have Kylie with council staff and Dustin with the commission to provide us the presentation on the Summer Flounder recreational measures 2022. Kylie, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to be back here in person. I have a presentation on Summer Flounder 2022 recreational measures, and Stephen will be helping me move through my slides. So thanks, Stephen. Next slide. I'm not sure if it's on the webinar. Great, thank you. Here's a timeline of the recreational measures process. So in August, the council and board set harvest and catch limits for the commercial and recreational fisheries for 2022 and 2023 for flounder based on the 2021 management track assessment. And on November 10th, the monitoring committee met to consider recreational measures and to make recommendations on 2022 recreational measures and strategies. The advisory panel met on November 18th. And today the council and board will consider, specific to summer flounder, adopting either coast-wide measures or conservation equivalency. Under conservation equivalency, then, which has been the typical path of the council and board for many years, the board and the states would then have a series of meetings early next year to consider modifying state waters measures if appropriate or needed. Next slide. So So today I'll review recent recreational fishery data, current measures and performance, and then review the staff recommendations described in the memo and the monitoring committee recommendations, which did differ from the staff recommendations for summer flounder, and then finally advisory panel recommendations. And we will look to the council board to adopt 2022 recreational measures, which is either conservation or coastwide measures for summer flounder to achieve the 2022 recreational harvest limit, which is 10.36 million pounds, and that's a 25% increase from the current harvest limit. Next slide. So for summer flounder, the council and board have the choice each year between coastwide measures, which would be the same bag limit, size limit, and season in every state and waters, or conservation equivalency, which allows different measures by state or region that collectively constrain harvest to the recreational harvest limit. And then the combined effect of all of those state and regional measures is equivalent to that set of coastwide measures. The federal regulations are put in place but waived, and then the anglers are subject to the measures in the state in which they land. And conservation equivalency has been implemented every year since about 2001, and for many years it was at a state-by-state level, and since 2014 it's been implemented on a regional basis. Next slide. So before discussing fishery performance, I want to recap just briefly some data considerations that we've talked about earlier this year regarding 2020 recreational estimates. So the 2020 estimates were impacted by COVID. While the efforts survey did continue uninterrupted, the shoreside intercept survey was suspended starting in March and April of 2020, and then resumed at various points in the year depending on the state. So the intercept survey does collect a lot of the key data that are used to develop catch estimates. Next slide. So to address this, MRIP developed 2020 estimates by filling in gaps with proxy data from 2018 and 2019. Matching the time, place, and fishing mode combinations that would have been sampled by APIS had the survey continued uninterrupted. And so then that proxy data was combined with observed data using the typical methodology to produce 20 estimates. And for this FMP within the management unit, this resulted in estimates that include about 19% imputed data for summer flounder, 25% for Scup, and 17% for black sea. So NIMS has indicated that when complete 2021 recreational data become available next year, they will evaluate the effects of including 2021 data, for example, instead of 2018 data in this methodology. But at this time, it's not known whether they will revise 2020 data based on this review. And then finally, another recreational data note is that we don't have recreational dead discard estimates in weight for 2020 for any of these species, to missing age and length information that's used to develop those estimates. Slide. For 2021, the council and board adopted regional conservation equivalency for summer flounder. And under conservation equivalency, the council and board must adopt two associated sets of measures, the non-preferred coastwide measures, which again are implemented in the federal regulations but waived. And for 2021, that includes a 19-inch minimum size, a 4-fish possession limit, and a May 15th to September 15th season. And then the precautionary default measures, which are the measures that would be implemented in any state or region that fails to develop adequate measures to constrain their harvest as required by the conservation equivalency guidelines. In 2021, those include a 2-fish possession limit, a 20-inch minimum size, and a July 1st to August 31st season. Slide. At the state and regional level, the measures have remained nearly identical for several years. From 2019 through 2021, shown in this table, the only change have been minor adjustments to the start and end dates for New Jersey's season, and then some seasonal adjustments in North Carolina to account for reductions that were needed on southern flounder. Size limits range from 15 to 19 inches, bag limits from 2 to 6 fish, and then varying seasons, with May to September being the prime fishing season for most states. Slide. So recreational harvest is shown in table 3 in the memo, and in this figure in millions of pounds, in millions of fish in orange. So these numbers do reflect the revised time series of MRIP. This time series suggests that harvest has generally declined since about 2013, particularly harvest in weight. 2020 harvest, again estimated using those proxy methods, was an increase from the previous 2 years. But then, as I'll discuss later in this presentation, expected 2021 harvest has gone down substantially and is projected to be the time series low in this figure since 1990, less than 6. Recreational fishery performance relative to the harvest limit is shown in this table. And for years through 2018, this is evaluated using prior time series of MRF, given that prior harvest limits were set using the old assessment. So we can't fairly compare the revised MRF estimates with the old harvest limits before 2019. And for 2019 and 2020, the comparison is made using new. Recreational fishery performance has been variable. We had a few years of in 2017 and 2019, we were very close to the harvest limit, and then in 2020, the RHL was exceeded by about 31%. So our 2021 RHL goes up 20, and as again, we expect to see pretty low harvest estimates for 2020. So we do not expect an overage in 2020. Next slide. For summer flounder, over the last 5 years, the percent of harvest and weight from state waters has averaged about 75%, although it's typically closer to 80%, and the estimate from 2020 is bringing that average down a bit. Slide. And by mode, about 86% of harvest and weight in recent years has been taken from the private rental fishery, with 4% coming from the party charter fleet and 4% from slide. We have recreational accountability measures in this fishery, including what we consider proactive accountability measures involving this process that we're doing today of adjusting our measures to ensure the upcoming year's ACL is not exceeded. And we also have reactive accountability measures which are described here and in the staff memo. And just briefly, the reactive AMs do depend on the stock status and the degree of overage. So pound for pound paybacks are required. The stock is overfished or under a rebuilding plan. And then accountability measures are evaluated by comparing a 3-year moving average of catch versus a 3 average catch limit in the recreational fishery. So if biomass is above the threshold but below the target, like it currently is for summer flounder, the reaction would depend on if the ACL is exceeded or if the ABC also exceeded. So if just the ACL is exceeded, the response would be adjustments to bag size and season. And if the ABC were also exceeded, a scaled single-year payback would be calculated. And then if biomass were above the target, like for Scup and black sea bass, the accountability measure would be adjustments to bag size and season, taking into account the performance of measures and conditions that precipitated the slide. So as I previously mentioned, we don't have 2020 dead discard information. So therefore, we can't really do this complete evaluation that we would typically do this year for 2020. The previous evaluation for 2017 through 2020 is shown here. We had 3 years of underages of the ACL from between 6% to 22% under. We do know that in 2020, our harvest limit was exceeded by about 33% or 31%. It's not possible to evaluate that using catch because we don't have that discard information. Does look like just based on harvest alone, 2020, about 87% of the ACL. We just don't know what that evaluation would turn up, but looking at the previous years, if we used a 3-year average, it doesn't seem necessarily likely that an AM would be triggered in this fishery. Slide. So moving on to 2021 harvest projections. So council staff used 2021 wave 1 through 4 data through August of this year to project harvest in pounds for the full year. Typically, we use just the prior year harvest proportions by wave to project the current year. And given the imputation and methods used for the 2020 estimates, the monitoring committee agreed that 2019 and 2020 average proportions of harvest by wave should be used to the projections, and projecting the harvest at a coastwide level instead of projecting by state and then using that. So using that methodology, the total projected harvest in 2021 would be 5.71 million. So there are a couple things to think about when we think about going from our projected current year harvest to what would expect next year under status quo measures. So first, we can look at effort, directed effort for summer flounder based on MRF trips, where summer flounder was the primary target, shown in the blue bars here. has generally been declining in recent years, but the 2020 data, effort data show sort of a rebound of directed trips on summer flounder. And effort dynamics might have changed due to COVID or something else, and we don't know exactly what effort would be to. Next slide. In addition, we should think about summer flounder availability and year class strength, which can be variable and impact availability of fish to anglers. So we did have below average recruitment in summer flounder fishery from 2011 to 2017. And in this case, we should look at and consider the 2018 and 19 year classes. So in 2018, recruitment was estimated to be above average and the largest year class since 2009. Those fish will be age 4 in 2022. And age 4 fish have a lot of variability in size. They generally range from about 15 to 23 inches. And it means that a lot of them will be recruiting to legal sizes in the recreational fishery as they reach the various minimum size limits. So it's also worth considering that 2019 recruitment is below average. Next slide. So another factor that staff recommend considering that the monitoring committee discussed quite a bit is the large variation in harvest that we've had for summer flounder, despite having nearly constant measures from 2018 through. As shown in this table, the harvest range from the projection that we have for this year of 5.71 million pounds to 10.06 million pounds in 2020. So the council staff recommendation kind of takes this into account by recommending use average harvest over these 4 years as sort of the baseline to for what we would consider expected harvest under status quo measures in 2022. And using that value of 7.79 million pounds, that would mean that between that and our 2022 RHL, which is 10.36 million pounds, that would leave room for a 33% liberalization. And that was the council staff recommendation to the monitoring committee as a starting point for discussion. Next slide. And council staff also recommended that in order to achieve that states and regions consider size limit decreases under conservation equivalency based on many years of stakeholder concerns with the current minimum size limits, including low retention rates, high regulatory discards, and we've heard a lot of concerns that it's potentially a sex ratio and the reproductive of the stock given targeting of large females. Next slide. So again, under conservation equivalency, we have to implement these non-preferred coastwide measures. These currently include 19 inches for fish and May 15th to September 15th. So because the RHL increases between 2021 and 2022 by about 25%, council staff recommended that non-preferred coastwide measures could be liberalized, but it's pretty hard to evaluate the effects of coastwide measures at this point, given many years of conservation measures by state. So it is difficult to evaluate, but as a starting point for discussion, we recommended to the monitoring committee thinking about a drop in the non-preferred minimum size limit from 19 to 18 inches, and a rough analysis of 2019 harvest and discard length frequency data indicated that that might result in about a 33% increase in harvest in numbers and 25% in weight. This analysis is very approximate, has several caveats, including that it was based on 2019. The lack of 2020 discard information. Next slide. And then staff recommended status quo precautionary default measures of 2 fish, 20 inches, July 1st to August 31st. Those measures are sufficiently restrictive in cases where the state would want to implement those. Next slide. So onto the monitoring committee recommendations. The monitoring committee agreed with using regional conservation equivalency in 2022 with the same regions that have been applied for several years. Next slide. And the monitoring committee also agreed with the methodology for developing 2021 harvest projections, but the monitoring committee was really concerned that the 2021 wave 1 through 4 estimates are much lower than recent years, and the projected harvest would be the lowest since the bulk of the FMP was implemented in 1993. And the monitoring committee didn't have a clear explanation for this low 2021 estimate, and especially since this is in contrast to Scup and black sea bass, which were higher than usual this year. So they thought this could indicate low summer flounder availability in 2021, consistent with what some monitoring committee members have heard holders in their states. One monitoring committee member noted that poor weather on a lot of weekends probably contributed to low opportunities targeting summer flounder. So the monitoring committee agreed that 2021 projection is not likely to be an appropriate proxy for 2022 harvest under status quo measures. As I mentioned, discussed that the MRIP data had shown large variations in the estimates over recent years with nearly, while 2021 harvest is low, did exceed the RHL in 2020. That was much closer to what we are aiming for in 2022. So the monitoring committee was concerned about this variability in terms of being able to liberalize measures. And in addition, the monitoring committee did note some uncertainty with availability in 2022, given that 2018 year class of them becoming available to the recreational fishery, which could increase harvest. Next slide. So for all of these reasons, the monitoring committee was not comfortable with the staff recommendation for that 33% liberalization and did think about a few different methods for calculating other possible liberalization amounts, but many monitoring committee members were concerned that these increases would still pose too much of a risk given the variation in harvest that we've seen. So given these concerns, the monitoring committee recommended status quo measures for summer flounder. However, they did note that if the council and board would like to liberalize, they would recommend a maximum increase of 16.5% at the state and regional level, which is half of that 33% recommended by staff. So again, for non-preferred coastwide measures, the monitoring committee also recommended status quo measures, including the 19 inches for fish, May 15th to September 15th. If the council and board prefer liberalizations to these measures, the monitoring committee recommended dropping the non-preferred minimum size limit to 18 inches from the current 19. And then based on a rough analysis of that, that would be an approximate 11% increase in harvest and weight and 14%. And the monitoring committee felt that was appropriately within the bounds of the percent that they recommended in the event council and board. So the monitoring committee also agreed with the staff recommendation for no changes to the precautionary default measures, 2 fish, 20 inches, July 1 to August 31st. Next slide. Moving on to the advisory panel comments from their November 18th meeting. Several advisors supported having separate regulations for the party and charter fleet. Some examples suggested were a higher bag limit or a small fish slot allowance. Another advisor mentioned this type of slot allowance for everyone, for example, including keeping 1 fish between 15 inches in addition to fish above the minimum size. One New Jersey fisherman said he supported status quo measures earlier in the season where folks seemed to be pretty successful with catching bigger fish at that time, but then moving to a slot limit later. Slide. One advisor expressed skepticism about the low 2021 MRIP estimates, given that 2018 year class and the trend of increased harvest for scup and black sea bass. And he also mentioned he was concerned about the variation in harvest under the same measures and said that makes it difficult as an advisor for him to make a recommendation. Several other advisors agreed that MRIP doesn't seem reliable either for 2021 specifically or in general. Slide. And one advisor requested that the council and board explore minimum hook size requirements to reduce discard mortality. One commercial advisor noted that they've seen more medium fish instead of jumbos this fall, and in agreement with estimates of high recruitment from a few years back. 3 advisors expressed support for continuing conservation equivalency in 2022. One stating that measures need to be tailored by region, given differences in availability along the coast. 2 advisors were concerned with accountability in the recreational fishery and supported status quo recreational measures for summer flounder. So by email or phone, we had several additional comments from AP members and members of the public, and 2 spoke in support of hook size regulations, one of which was reiterated a comment from the meeting. There was 1 request for a total length limit with mandatory retention, and 1 supported status quo measures and stated fluke may be in trouble. And then 3 were concerned with recreational measures focusing mortality on large breeding. So that concludes my presentation. And in summary, here are the decision points for the council, along with the monitoring committee recommendations summarized below each item. So coastwide measures or conservation equivalency, and then if conservation equivalency, we post-wide measures and precautionary default measures, as well as guidance on the degree of change in measures allowed by states or regions.
Okay, thanks, Kylie. If anybody has any questions at this time for Kylie. Okay, a couple hands are coming up. Let's start with Joe Semino. Go ahead, Joe.
Questions. One, I'm sure that class would have size limits.
My understanding is it's a little hard to, it would be a little bit variable because age 4 fish, I think there's more divergence in size as you get to the ages. So I think at age 4 fish, I think this is information I got from Mark Tercero, but there's more of a variation in size, and most of them range from about 15 to inches. But so it's a little hard to say exactly at what age they.
Follow up, Joe, and if you could bring your mic just a little closer to you.
Yes, thank you. I do have a follow-up, and it's a memory of, I think you said the 2018 year class is the biggest 2000. Memory is Mark Tercero saying that after some years running through the model, it appeared that 2009 year class wasn't quite as big as the survey result. And I'm just curious if that's true. And
Yeah, I mean, I would have to look in a little bit more detail to see where 2009 falls, but it's certainly the largest in sort of recent history. I think it is above average, and we certainly had that below average recruitment from 2011 through 2017. That definitely makes that stand out as kind of the last year of good recruitment that we had prior to 2018.
Okay, thanks, Kylie. Next on my list, I have Adam Nowalski.
Thank you very much. There have been many years in the past where we have set rec measures based on a comparison of the year's landings to the subsequent RHL. There's been a lot of conversation about it, but that 1-to-1 year comparison is what we've looked at a number of years with considerations by the monitoring committee. If you were to look at that comparison this year, have a 5.71 million pound 2021 projected landings, 10.36 million pound RHL for 2022, that would on paper look like an 81% liberalization opportunity for recreation. Now, I think staff did a tremendous job, and I'm looking for confirmation from staff in saying that they have already taken a huge number of considerations in putting together their staff recommendation for not an 81% liberalization, but a 33% liberalization, including concerns about the health of the resource, including the validity of the MRIP data, including what they're hearing from advisors and information. So that 33% number is already a huge middle ground. It sounds to me like you've taken a large number of considerations to go from what could have been an 81% offered liberalization here today to a 33% number from the staff recommendation. And I'd just like to hear that my assumptions about what staff did to get to 33 are accurate.
Kylie.
Yeah, that's essentially correct. So typically we look at the projected current year harvest and compare it to the following year's RHL to look at where we staff we didn't really feel comfortable that looking at how low the harvest projection was for 2021 and how much harvest has varied over the same measures in recent years, that didn't seem like an appropriate comparison to us this year. So as I mentioned, we took the last 4 years, including the 2021 projection, and then averaged that with harvest back to 2018 to kind of come up with a baseline from where we felt comfortable calculating the liberalization. That average was 7.79 million pounds, and that's where we got the 33%. So you are correct. It would be a lot higher if we did our typical comparison of the current year's projection to the following year's RHL. So that 33% was already kind of a compromise from that larger number.
Okay, thanks, Kylie. Next, I have Jason McNamee. Go ahead, Jason.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound good.
Excellent. Thanks, Kylie, for the presentation. All of the information are really well done. And I will apologize because I really couldn't hear Joe Cimino, and I'm afraid I'm about to ask exactly what Joe was asking about. Maybe I'll ask it in a little bit of a different way. But the thing I was curious about, Kylie, is that recruitment estimate from 2018. I'm trying to get a sense of how close to the terminal year of the assessment is that? Is it, 1 year away from the terminal year? I think that's the answer, but I just want to confirm that. And then if you could remind me if there's a retrospective pattern in the recruitment information, I'd also be interested in what direction that is. I'd be interested to hear that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, so the 2018 estimate, yeah, that is 1 year off from the terminal year. In the 2021 management track assessment, the data went through 2019. So you're correct about that. And regarding the retrospective, I don't remember exactly what it looks like off the top of my head, but I think any retrospectives in this model are pretty minor. So there's a minor retrospective that tends to overestimate F and overestimate SSB, but it's pretty minor. And I'm not quite sure about the recruitment.
Thank you, Kylie.
All right, thank you. Rick Bellavance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kylie, for the presentation. Great job. I wanted to comment that I do think 4-year average is a 2021 catch projections do seem low and 20 seem pretty high, right? So when you have a question about just help me understand calculations monitoring committee. So the recommendation from staff was in weight numbers of fish.
It's in weight, since what we focus on, at the council's the performance relative to the harvest limit. I know that, during the process of development of measures, I believe sometimes states will do those calculations in numbers of fish, but our recommendation was for weight, just to get to that harvest limit.
Oh, sorry, follow up, thanks. So, and so then the monitoring committee recommended taking that liberalization, cutting it in half to 5% reduction in weight. Recommended a set of measures that 11% reduction in weight. Right, that's what I'm getting confused. 14% for the 18.5-inch size recommended by the monitoring committee would result in a 11% increase in the, trying to get that square in my head for, should I be comparing that to the 16.5% number, or should I use the 14% instead of the 16.5 number? Or I'm getting myself wandered around the axis. That's why I'm asking. Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, overall, the monitoring committee recommended status quo, but if the council and board want to liberalize, you know, we still do have to think about non-preferred coastwide measures. And for the non-preferred coastwide measures, the monitoring committee recommended a half-inch drop in the size limit. That was calculated to be an approximate 11% increase in weight and 14% in numbers of fish. I think that, you know, the monitoring committee wasn't necessarily looking for an exact match to that 16.5%. First of all, given just how kind of difficult it is to calculate the effects of non-preferred coastwide measures, and, you know, you can only kind of do half-inch drops in size limit, and that was primarily what they were focused on. So instead of the 19-inch that staff recommended, they wanted to go with the 18.5 and felt that that kind of 11% increase in weight, 14% numbers of fish was sort of ballpark what we were looking at with the 16.5%, but that ultimately would be for the non-preferred coastwide measures that wouldn't get implemented if conservation equivalency. So, does that answer your question?
Okay, thank you. I don't have any other hands left at this time for members of the council or the board. One last time before we jump into a discussion over setting the measures. Is there anyone from the audience that has a question for staff? Not a comment regarding the measures. We'll hold off on that until we have something to debate. Seeing none at this time. So we're faced with a decision at this point. Kylie presented that there is a staff recommendation for a liberalization up to 33%. Monitoring committee has come back with their recommendation for something less than that, which would be the 16.5% liberalization based on the data. There's also been some discussion around the table and with members of the council and the board with me, and likely Justin as well, regarding a status quo approach for moving forward. And we have some motions drafted. We have liberalization motions and status quo motions that we can begin the discussion with. I'd kind of look around the table to see if anyone has an interest in making that motion. So think about that. I have Mike Pentney with his hand up. I'm going to call on Mike and then we'll come back unless Mike wants to make the motion. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. No, I actually have a question. I'm trying to clarify what the monitoring committee's recommendation is, because I keep hearing two things. Either they recommended status quo or they recommended a 16.5% liberalization. Can someone clarify what the actual monitoring committee's recommendation is, please?
Yeah, Mike, I think the way I understand it is the recommendation from the monitoring committee is status quo. However, if the board and the council decide they want to liberalize, then their recommendation would be not to implement the full liberalization that staff recommended of 33%, but consider a 16.5% liberalization. So it's kind of it's a fallback in the event that the board and the council want to liberalize. They're suggesting not taking the full staff recommendation, but something less than that. Does that help with understanding that, Mike?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so what is the pleasure of the council and the board at this time? Would anyone like to jump in, and if you give me an indication as to type of motion that you'd like to make, whether it's regarding status quo or liberalization, we can pull something up for you. Adam Nowalski.
Wanted to make sure my hand picking stuff up here. Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and make the recommendation and a motion on behalf of the council and the board. Move to adopt conservation equivalency 2022 summer flounder recreational management and allow for up to a 16.5% liberalization in state or regional measures. Non-preferred coastwide measures would include 18.5-inch minimum size, 4 fish possession limit, and open season from May 15th to September 15th. In addition, the precautionary default measures would include 20-inch minimum size, fish possession limit, and open season July 1st to August 30th.
Okay, thank you, Adam. So Adam's made a motion on behalf of the council and the board. I'm going to ask members of the council if anyone would like to second that motion. Anyone from the council? Yeah, Scott Lennox. Going to second that motion on behalf of the council. And to make it a motion for debate, let's go ahead. Let me ask if there's a board member that would like to second that motion. I have John Clark seconding the motion on behalf of the board. Adam, did you want to speak to your rationale for that motion?
Yeah, if I could ask Stephen to put up the most current biomass image that I'd provided earlier, and while he's pulling that up, again, I've got to go back to the comments that I made earlier in that our typical process, that was staff's words a few minutes ago, typical process would have considered 81% liberalization. I have long been an advocate for using MRIP in a manner for which it was intended. I'm not even going to try to advocate for an 81% liberalization and a one-year comparison. Haven't done it for a long time. I won't do it today. But I think staff has done a phenomenal job of incorporating all the concerns that we would debate around the table, including concerns about MRIP, went ahead and now taken a multi-year approach, concerns about 1 year as a lower number, as an outlier, concerns about where we are with the resource, and I guess Stephen's having some trouble pulling that up, but the most recent image shows an increasing biomass trend, demonstrates that the 2018 year, based on the best scientific information we have, is a top 10 recruit. We have positive recruitment years going back to 2009. This is not a fishery that for 3 decades shown no positive signs. In the last 15 years, we've seen biomass amongst the highest it's ever been at, seen good recruitment years. What we are experiencing is areas of localized depletion, with a lot of environmental impacts, including climate concerns, including beach replenishment, including elements that we're putting in the water that are causing issues locally. What we are seeing is changing migratory patterns of these fish. People that were used to catching them in certain areas now have to travel further or to areas than where they used to. Those are undeniable. But what we see is a fishery and a positive biomass trend, have good recruitment. A typical analysis could have provided, thank you, and thanks for putting that chart up. A typical analysis, we'd be contemplating 81%. Staff recommends 33. We're now down to me making a motion of 16.5%. That's already a tremendous give, in my opinion. That is a tremendous. You want to talk about a precautionary approach? That's a picture of a precautionary approach that should be in every dictionary right there. So I stand by the motion. I look forward to support from my fellow council and board members here today, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam. Let me go next to Scott Lennox to see if he has any rationale that he wants to add. Go ahead, Scott. You have something?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to second it for the discussion portion of it, but I agree with Adam 100% when we have an opportunity to have any kind of liberalization. I think it's a good idea, and staff seems to have done the work to make this, a feasible thing for us to do. So I'm all for it.
Okay, thanks, Scott. John Clark?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Adam, great explanation for the only thing it's an up to 16.5% liberalization. So I think states and regions can decide how much they would like to liberalize or not at all. Good motion. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Kylie, can you remind me of the regions? You have something quickly?
Yeah, I think it's on my slide that shows the state measures. And so just, well, it's kind of highlighted on my slide with the state measures, but slide 8, if you want to pull that up, Stephen, it kind of shows different highlighting. So it's Mass and Rhode Island are each individual regions. Connecticut, New York, New Jersey has to be its own region given the different measures in Delaware Bay. And then Delaware, Maryland, PRFC, and Virginia, and then North Carolina.
Okay. Yeah, it's been a little while since I've seen that. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, further discussion on the motion. Joe Cimino.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess this will be a good test if people can hear me. Feel free to fire away there. I'm curious if it's inherent in this motion that that minor bit of CE that we've been doing, taking the season by a few days, is still allowed.
Yeah, I think what this motion would allow, well, if this motion passes, the states would then consider within their region a 16.5% liberalization to their state measures, which would allow for that discussion. I mean, since New Jersey is its own region, you could decide on how you want to take that liberalization. It's a little different from a status quo. If status quo were being considered, there might be some opportunity to tweak the season a little bit in order to account for a weekend. But under this scenario, you're looking at some additional liberalizations, which I think would help you include whatever weekends or time frame that you're considering. Bill Hyatt?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound good, Bill.
Okay, very good. Yes, I'd like to speak in support of this motion. I think it represents a reasonable compromise given what I see as conflicting signals that we've been presented. I would love to support the staff recommendations, but I think I favor a more cautious approach, particularly given the high harvest in 2020, sort of the history of recruitment variability, maybe low recruitment with the exception of 2018. And that the 2021 harvest estimate seems like somewhat of an outlier. One of the things that comes to my mind is the desire to avoid flip-flops from year to year. And so I do see there's a lot of conflicting signals here. However, given all that I've heard, I think this sort of splits that pretty nicely and presents a compromise that I hope we can all live with. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Paul Reese.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I strongly agree with the previous comments everybody has made. I just would like to add that taking advantage of this liberalization is very important in my view because summer flounder is a big fish in the recreational industry, and liberalizing these measures take a lot of pressure off of other species. That's something we need to.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Jason McNamee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also support the motion. I wanted to quickly offer, I very much appreciate the monitoring committee's comments, their sort of, words of caution, and I agree with those. I think there's a lot of things to be cautious about here. that, kind of banking this 2018 recruitment event just yet. And all of the things that have been mentioned, I think are all fair, and we should consider them. However, I think this, I don't know, maybe compromise or whatever, this halfway point, the smaller increase, I think meets the goal of trying to continue to manage to the stock assessment and the harvest estimates, but not trying to push right up against the bounds, giving ourselves a little bit of cushion. And I also think it's a small enough amount, there won't be room enough to make radical departures from the current management measures. So this seems safe enough. So I also support the motion.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate your comments on that. Are there any other members of the board or the council that would like to provide comment on the motion before us? I'm not seeing any other members. I do see members of the public. So let's go to the audience. I've got 2 hands raised at this time. Victor Hartley, you want to step up to the public mic? Just introduce yourself before you start. Thanks.
Captain Victor Hartley. I represent myself along with a lot of the about 30 party boats left in the state of New Jersey. Just did a count when we used to have probably 200 in every port up and down our coast. I learned something today that Adam said, which was the liberalization should have been 81%. Then we went to 33%. Now we're down to 16%. I'm sure there's some people who don't even want to see that. Every single year I come here and I watch people at this table take precautions, and they're not even out at sea with us every single day. How 2020 was over by 31% would be beside me, because it was COVID. Every headboat in the state carried less passengers. We caught the same fish in 2020 as we did in 2021, a ton of fish that we threw back and very few that we kept because of the size. They're all within this size that is just below where we can keep. We're traveling, like Adam said, further. They're not in the Raritan Bay. There's tons of fish in the Raritan Bay, don't get me wrong, but not fish that I can keep. So I have to travel clear out in the ocean off of Long Island to catch fish. The for-hire fleet makes up 4%. One thing I'd like to ask, the for-hire fleet is broken up into 2 sections. Inspected vessels, which are very regulated, and the Joe Blow. There's some professional charter guys, but there's a lot of charter guys that aren't. And I'd love to see what our dead discard rate is for the party boat, for the inspected fleet. Because I know on my boat, we push circle hooks so we don't kill anything. A lot of bucktails, which Flounder can't swallow. I just think we got to liberalize this more than 16%, like 33%. And something else we need to see, if we didn't go over the ACL this year, why can't we carry that to 2021? It is allowed, from what I understand, the regulations. And I'm sure maybe a council member could help me here, because I didn't get to research it enough last night. But like, we didn't go over 2020 or 2021. So for 2022, why can't we carry some of that over? So we don't go over. You liberalize, plus you carry over what we didn't use. And then another question I'd like to ask is, can we start, and this would have to be for the for-hire fleet, especially inspected vessels, can we look at days at sea? So we don't get blamed, like say a headboat like mine, I didn't fish 4 days this week because of lack of passengers. So if I had days at sea, and every headboat had days at sea where we called in or whatever we have to do to our state, hey, I'm fishing today. So I don't lose a day. Maybe my season gets extended because I didn't lose 5 days due to weather. And I think asking states, I love the recreational fishery, but I can only talk for the for-hire mostly. We have a great striped bass program in the state of New Jersey. Very monitored. I don't use half my tags that I'm given. We've never went over. I don't understand why each state can't at least maybe start with their for-hire sector or their party boats or whatever you want to call them and start monitoring their own catch estimates, because the MRIT data is totally bad. There's no way we went over 31% in 2020. There's no possible way. I mean, in my opinion, but that's all I would ask. And if I could find out at some point what the dead discard rate is of a for-hire vessel inspected. I'd like to ask if somebody could look into that for me so I can know a little better for next year. But I believe we should liberalize this more than 16%. We need more days. Oh, and we need to also, I'm the one that suggested the slot fish. That's something we need to look at, because we need passengers to be able to take one fish home. If I had a slot fish this year at 17 inches, every one of my customers would have taken a fish home. We would have lost less dead discards. And I probably would have been packing my boat every day if they knew they could take a fish home. But the monitoring thing, we have to get a better situation on it, whether it's through the states. And I don't know anybody from New York, but I would ask that New York look at the Raritan Bay like New Jersey did the Delaware Bay, because it's hard for the Jersey boats who cross the line and can keep an 18-inch fish, but yet the New York boats can't. So it kind of makes a little bit of a enforcement nightmare for us, not really for them because they don't keep an 18-inch fish, but if they could, it would make enforcement better for us. So we could cross back and forth across the line without worrying about whether we're going to get a ticket or keep illegal fish on their side, because those fish don't know the difference between the line. So if New York could look into that, that would kind of help us a lot, and working like Jersey did Delaware Bay. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Victor. And we'll see if we can get some information for you regarding discards. The other thing too to pay attention to, I know a lot of your, excuse me, a lot of your comments kind of around the idea of a separation between the party charter and the recreational private angler, kind of maybe separating the management. And we've considered that around this table through a sector separation concept for under our recreational reform initiative. And so those discussions they're likely to be coming up to, debates around this table in the future. So just something to keep your eyes on.
And just so everybody understands, and I know there's a lot of people in the RFA against me on this, it's not that I want to separate the recreational and the party boats. I have a problem with the recordings. I know that every day I use electronic, my iPad, I'm having a little problems right now, so I'm trying to get it dealt with. I report every day. We're 4% of the number according to your staff. You know what our numbers are. I can't make the recreational boats report like I do. I just want to be in control of my own quota, whether it's days at sea, which somebody suggested to me last night. I think that's a great idea, because if I don't sail 10 days, I don't lose those days. They can go on the back end of my season. But I can't make the little boat report. And if our state at least took control of the head boats, the inspected vessels that are very regulated, Coast Guard, they would have accurate numbers for us. And then, hey, then maybe it can lead to the little boats and the recreational fishermen. I know that, like I said, the biggest component against this is the RFA, but I can't control little boats. I can only control my inspected fleet friends to make sure it happens, because we're commercial. No matter how you look at it, we are commercial boats. We're not some Joe Schmo who goes out for a living. I want my kids to be doing this for life. I mean, so I have to make them where they can carry the most passengers. So they need to be able to catch the most fish. And not everybody keeps everything we catch. Porgies, we don't keep all of them. We definitely don't keep 50, but they'd be cleaning for days. But because we have them. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Next, I have James Fletcher. Go ahead, James. If you're speaking, we can't hear you, James. Doesn't look like you're on mute. Can you hear us? It looks like you're. I'm not sure, James. You're back on mute again. Try it one more time to unmute yourself.
Are we there now?
There you go.
Okay. I was under the impression we were supposed to use the best available science. And I have submitted to council and council staff the concept of BOFFFF, which is technically new science saying that we are supposed to protect the big, old, fat, fecund female fish. Now, this proposal totally goes against that. I was under the impression that the council was supposed to comply with the Magnuson Act. And the 2006 Magnuson Act said that every saltwater recreational fishing was supposed to register some way or another. It's not been done, so we're discussing recreational fishing and have no idea of the number, and we're discussing a fish size that flies in the face of the best available science. I ask each council member, wherever you're sitting, look up that BOFFFF as it applies to fishery and see if it isn't common sense. This regulation flies in the face of it, and before y'all vote on it, please look that up. We're going down backwards, and we can't understand why we have a spawning stock biomass and are not getting recruitment. The problem is we have small fish in the spawning stock biomass and are taking the big ones out. That's the reason we're not getting the recruitment. The same number of fish, large fish, would give us 10 to 50 times more recruitment. We have done this thing backwards. Now, was it intentional or stupidity? I don't know, but we have a chance now. Don't vote this in, vote something else. But this will not help the fish. Thank you for your time. James Fletcher, United National Fishermen's Association.
Okay, thanks, James. Appreciate your comment. I don't see any other hands from the public at this time. So I'm going to.
Yeah, it's Paul Hartel. I thought I had my hand raised.
I'm sorry. I didn't. Go ahead. If I can't, I don't know. I couldn't hear you very well. It was very mumbled.
It's Paul Hartel. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, I thought I had my hand raised, but I'm from the Jersey Coast Anglers Association, and I just like to say that we agree with the 16.5% liberalization. Of course, we'd like to see something greater, but I think that's precautionary enough. And also just something to remember in the future when we have a recommendation to restrict the fisheries by 81% or 33%, perhaps we won't have to take such as a big cut when it's that way as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll go ahead and we'll allow for one more comment from the public. I see Mike Wayne's hand. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Wayne with the American Sport Fishing Association. Paul pretty much said what I wanted to say, and I think Mr. Nowalski did a good job justifying the motion here. I just wanted to mention, because it didn't get brought up, I think this speaks to the importance of the recreational reform initiative and the harvest control rule approach that we're pursuing here. You've got a 5 million pound swing in harvest using the same rec measures. There's a lot of variability in MRIP. And I'd like to see us continue to focus on finding solutions for the situation that we're in here through that rec reform initiative and the harvest control rule approach and the other decisions today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay, back to the table. Jason McNamee, I think your hand might still be up from a previous comment, so I'll check with you on that. So give that some thought. I'm going to go next to Roy Miller. Then I have Tom Fody. Go ahead, Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just checking first to see if you can hear me okay.
Yeah, you sound fine, Roy. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm having to juggle between do I hear well or am I able to project well? So right now I'll try projecting. I want to support the motion. We don't know, of course, what that 16.5% liberalization is going to look like in terms of regulations at this point. But under the assumption that maybe we could consider a 16-inch within the Delmarva region of Delaware to Virginia instead of 16.5 as our minimum size limit, I think that would be a good thing. As a fisherman, I always debate whether I should have the mouth closed or the mouth open when I get a total length measurement, and that would eliminate some of that uncertainty of that half inch. I'm not a big fan of half-inch minimum size increments. So I like the idea of possibly going down to 16%, or 16 inches. So that's why I support the motion. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. Tom Fody, you have the last word.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Tom. I wasn't worried that you were not going to be able to amplify your voice through the mic, but go ahead. Yeah, we hear you great. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm not speaking as the commissioner since Peter Clark is sitting in it for me as a proxy because I've got bad back problems. But anyway, I was listening to Fletcher, and I usually don't disagree with Fletcher, but let's remember what happened. We rebuilt this stock on 15, 16, 14-inch fish. A summer flounder starts becoming sexually mature at 12. So by the time it reaches 15 to 16 inches, it is basically producing a lot of babies. It's just not working. And again, that the stock assessment is not based on, I said over and over again, that recruitment is not based on spawning stock biomass in summer flounder. So that's not the reason we're not getting younger the year in recruitment. We just don't know the reason why. Now, some of us think it's environmental reasons, and I'll leave it at that. But I just wanted to make sure I was clear there. I also I heard the young charter boat guy from talking about New Jersey, but there's a lot of New Jersey partying charter boats, including the United Boatman is on record and Jersey Coast is on record, and not supporting sector separation because we didn't want to lock party boats and the charter boats into a small quota because the quotas will be set when the stocks are low. And we've never changed that position over the years. Thank you for being patient.
Okay, I appreciate that, Tom. Thank you. Okay, so that concludes the discussion around this motion. I'd like to take 2 minutes for states to caucus, and then we'll come back. I'll read the motion into the record. We're going to start with a council vote, and then I'll turn the mic over to my co-chair, Mr. Davis, for the board. 2 minutes. Thank you. Okay, I think we've had the time. I'm looking around the table. It appears that the states have had time to caucus on this and are ready to cast their votes. Stephen's not behind the curtain over there. Paul Hartle, could you please put your hand down? That's the last hand that I have up on my screen. We're going to use the hand raised function for voting.
Okay, I'm going to try.
There you go. Okay, you're off now. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to start this with a council vote first, and then I'll turn it over for the board vote. The motion is move to adopt conservation equivalency for 2022 summer flounder recreational management and allow up to a 16.5% liberalization in state or regional measures. Non-preferred coastwide measures would include an 18.5-inch minimum size, 4-fish possession limit, and open season from May 15th through September 15th. In addition, the precautionary default measures would include a 20-inch minimum size, 2-fish possession limit, and open season from July 1st through August 31st. All those members of the council who support this motion, please raise your hand. Okay, the screen is still jumping around on me. Give me another second here. Let's get everybody's votes on. Okay, no one touch their computers for a second here. Okay, we have 19 in favor. We can clear the hands. I think, Stephen, are you able to clear the hands for the group? Okay, everything's down. You can clear them. There we go. Okay, all those opposed?
Mike, that was 19, you said? Sorry.
I'm sorry. It was 19, yes, Kylie. 19 in favor. Any opposition? Any abstentions? One abstention from Garfo. Motion carries the council. I'm going to pass it over to my co-chair, Justin Davis, to call the question to the board. Justin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we'll try doing this the easy way. Is there any opposition on the board to this motion? Okay, not seeing any opposition, I'll ask if there are any abstentions. NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service as an abstention. We'll note that the motion passes by unanimous consent with one abstention.
There were 2 abstentions. Justin, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also abstained.
Thanks, Tony.
Okay, thank you. The motion carries. So let me ask Kylie and Dustin, is there anything, or I'm sorry, Bob, you had your hand up. Did you have something you wanted to add?
I was just going to note the second abstention.
Kylie or Dustin, I do have a question for Dustin, but is there anything else that needs to come before us at this time for decision making?
Not for me. I believe there was some interest in talking about commission next steps. I don't know if that was your question, but.
It's like you read our minds up here. So yeah, Dustin, if you could give us commission next steps on this liberalization and what we need to do. I guess it would be before the January meeting, I would think, but I'll let you give us guidance on that. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm just going to wait a second here while we get the right slides up on the screen. All right, perfect. All right, so I just prepared a few bullets here to go over next steps. The first one we just went over, where conservation equivalency was approved. This would be followed by a January TC meeting. We've already begun to schedule it to see if we can get maximum availability. Hopefully we'll get representation from all states, where the TC will go over guidelines, basically the methodology for approving and developing regional proposals. Then during this time, states will be working amongst themselves and within regions and with their stakeholders to develop proposals for their regional measures. And then in January, the board would meet at the commission's winter meeting to approve the methodology that states can use to further develop their regional proposals. And then in February, the TC would review these proposals, and then this would be followed by a separate board meeting. It would be board only, but it would be outside of the commission's quarterly meetings, where the board would review the state proposals, the TC recommendations, and then establish the final measures. And then lastly, following up on this, sometime in March, sometimes it occurs in April, but the commission would send a letter to the regional administrator certifying the board approved measures, saying that in combination, it would achieve but not exceed the RHL.
Okay, thanks, Dustin. Okay, with that said, appreciate your summary there. Adam Nowalski.
Just wondering, given that this isn't new, do we need to go through the TC meeting again to come up with guidelines? Is there a way that we could make a decision as a board here today to just use previously approved guidelines? I mean, do we really think it's going to change? Or could we put the previous guidelines in place and just bring things forward and wrap this up at the board at our winter meeting?
There are some data considerations, which years should be used. Sometimes the methodology might differ a little bit, especially considering 2020 and the imputations there. Now, this had been done via email for Bluefish in 2019, so it's possible, but given complexity of the data and so on, this is at least how staff has been proposing it, but if it's the will of the board to settle this more expediently, I would turn to Bob, but I think that would be possible.
Bob?
Yeah, thanks. I do think, as Dustin mentioned, there are some unique data issues this go around with 2020 data and some other things. And I also think, even if everything was the same, getting the regions together to come up with proposals, given the holidays are upon us, and getting a technical review and having all that done and distributed to the board for a decision last week of January might be difficult. Just understanding some of the state public processes and other things. I think we probably have to stick with an external meeting a little bit later in the maybe early spring or late winter.
All right, thanks, Bob. Thanks, Dustin, for that. Okay, that concludes our business under this item on the agenda. Let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break and come back at 11:12, and we'll pick up on Scup measures. Thank you. All right, this is everyone's 1-minute warning. If you can start making your way back to your seats. Start up in 1 minute. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So during the break, I had some guidance from staff about the audio issues again. Well, I wouldn't say again. We're having some slight audio issues, not so much, at least for me in this room and hearing the public, but the public's having a hard time hearing us. And one of the things that Mary has picked up on is that if I were to talk to John Clark and turn my head like this, it completely cuts out from the audio. And if I put my hand in front of my mouth or if there's any distraction from my voice going to the microphone, the public's having a difficult time because it's cutting off the entire microphone, so there's no sound. So if you could, when you're speaking, I know it's nice to look down the table at the person you're asking a question to or speaking to, but if you could just do your best to try to put your voice right to the microphone, that's going to be helpful for the public and for members of the council and the board who are participating virtually. So I'll probably say that 2 or 3 more times today, but that's okay. Well, as long as they can hear us and hear our discussion, that's what we need to do. Okay, so next I'm going to go to Carson and Dustin. Yeah, Carson and Dustin are going to give us a presentation on the Scup recreational measures for 2022. So whenever you're ready, Carson.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair, and hopefully this is loud enough for people. So you can go to the next slide, please. The objectives today are similar as what we just did for summer flounder. So the council and board will first review the recent fishery performance and recreational management measures, and then we will review the staff, monitoring committee, and AP recommendations. And then the action item today is to adopt 2022 federal recreational measures for Scup. So as you'll recall, in July this year, the SSC recommended ABCs for 2022 and 23 based on the management track assessment. And this resulted in the council and board adopting a 2022 RHL of 6.08 million pounds, which is just slightly higher than the 2021 RHL of 6.07 million pounds. Biomass is still very high, but has a declining trend, and recruitment has been low in recent years, with 2019 being the lowest estimated in the time series. And this graph shows, oh, next slide, thanks. So this graph shows the Scup recreational harvest since 1980, and millions of fish is in blue and millions of pounds is shown in orange. So the 2020 recreational harvest was 12.91 million pounds, and that was using the imputed MREP data that Kylie gave an overview of. And as you can see, recent harvest has been notably higher than the 2022 RHL of 6.08 million pounds, so about double. This next slide, yep. This table summarizes recent RHLs compared with recreational harvest limits. And just as a reminder, when we look at this table, the recreational performance through 2018 can be evaluated using the old MREP estimates. So those first two columns can be compared with each other to get the third column for those years. And this comparison shows recreational Scup harvest was 1 to 13 or to 35% below the RHL. And then the 2019 RHL was set using old estimates, and the 2019 harvest was estimated using new MREP estimates, which is the column on the far right. So for 2019, the harvest estimate was back calibrated by MREP for GARFO in order to be compared to the RHL. And then 2020 is the first year that the harvest estimates and RHL were both using the new MREP estimates, and the harvest was about double the RHL. So 2020, as you'll recall, was also the first year that status quo was recommended after the recognition that there was a mismatch between predicted harvest and the RHL. And this was due to the need for management to decide how best to respond to the new MREP estimates that were much higher than previously thought. Next slide. So this graph shows the recreational harvest by state from 2018 to 2020 as a percent of total harvest. So as you can see, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey make up the vast majority of recreational landings. And New York has had the highest recreational landings for the past 3 years, making up 38 to 49% of total recreational harvest coastwide. And then the states not listed on this graph collectively make up less than 1% of the Scup recreational harvest. Next slide. Okay, so this graph shows the recreational harvest by mode over the past 5 years, as well as the average shown in that final column. And the majority of Scup landed recreationally in recent years was by private rental boats, which averaged 62% of recreational Scup harvest. And not shown on this slide, but I just wanted to note that over that same time period, the vast majority of Scup are caught in state waters. So about 94% of the recreational harvest came from state waters during those years. Next slide. So now I'll move from recent harvest to projections for 2021 and expected 22 harvest. So this table shows different ways of estimating harvest for 2021, which would then be used as a proxy for 2022 and compared with the 22 RHL. And as staff outlined in the memos, in past years, the monitoring committee has commented on the use of coastwide projections using multiple year averages when possible as the basis for estimated catch in the upcoming year. And coastwide projections and using multi-year averages can represent a more appropriate use of the MREP data compared to state-by-state projections based on a single year of proportions. So because measures have remained status quo for Scup from 2019 to 2021, staff used an average of those years with the coastwide projection for 2021 as expected 22 harvest. And that's the highlighted value in the table, which is more than double the RHL. Next slide. So now moving on to what the current management measures are. These are the federal recreational measures, and they've been in place unchanged since 2015. So the bag limit is 50 fish, the size limit is 9 inches total length, and the season is open year round. Next slide. And then these are the recreational measures by state, and these have remained status quo since 2019. This slide shows Massachusetts through New York, And the minimum sizes are 9 inches with the exception of a couple of shore programs. And then the bag limits are 30 with a 50 fish bonus wave. And then all states have an open season year round, the same as the federal measures. Next slide. So this is New Jersey through North Carolina, and New Jersey matches the federal measures, whereas Delaware through North Carolina have an 8-inch minimum size, an open season, and a 30 or 50 fish bag limit. But as you'll recall, Delaware through Maryland make up a very small percentage of the Scup recreational harvest. Next slide. So now I'll move on to a brief recap of the recreational measures discussions for the past 2 years. In 2019, the monitoring committee, board, and council discussed the restrictions that would be needed to constrain harvest to the RHL in 2020 due to the changes in the MRIP estimation methodology. And the scale of these impacts couldn't be accurately predicted prior to the completion of those operational stock assessments in 2019. So this left the council and board with very little time to consider how to respond to the changes in MRIP estimates before they needed to be applied in management. And so these groups avoided imposing large-scale restrictions on anglers as management adjusts to the new MRIP numbers, especially given that the stock biomass has been high and was double the target in 2018. They felt that there was little to no risk to the stock by allowing this status quo for 2020. And some of these considerations remain relevant in that the summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass allocation amendment is still ongoing, along with the work being done on the recreational reform initiative and harvest control rule framework. However, status quo was intended to be a temporary situation. Next slide, please. So moving on to last year, there was an added issue where there were no 2020 recreational harvest estimates due to COVID-related sampling gaps, along with being in the similar management situation. And so the council and board and monitoring committee didn't have data to predict the outcome of any change in management measures. And then additionally, there was the idea that the availability of scup to anglers was high during 2016 to 19 because of the abundant 2015 year class. And it was thought that availability may be declining. So 2019 would not be a good proxy for 2020. Next slide, please. So moving on to the staff memo for this year. When the council and board made these recommendations, as I said, they emphasized this was a temporary approach during these ongoing management actions. And if there are management changes from these actions, they would be implemented for the 2023 fishing year and would not be available for 2022 use. So in consideration of a third year of status quo, allowing multiple years of recreational overages may pose a risk to the stock, even at high biomass levels. And additionally, NIFS has indicated that although status quo measures were justified for 2020 and 2021, despite expected RHL overages, this approach may not be justifiable for 2022. Next slide, please. So continuing some of the considerations outlined in the staff memo, based on the 2021 management track assessment, the scup stock is healthy with SSB estimated to be about 2 times the reference point in 2019. However, recruitment has been below average, and 2019 is estimated to be the lowest of the time series. And so if reductions are deemed to be appropriate this year, an estimated 56% reduction in harvest is the value that would be needed to prevent exceeding the RHL based on that proxy 2022 estimate. And staff discussed different bag limit reductions, size restrictions, or seasonal closures that could be used to reduce harvest. And when discussing changes to federal measures, it's important to note that, as I mentioned earlier, only 6% of the harvest occurs in federal waters. So impactful reductions would need to occur in both state and federal measures. Next slide. So this table shows the proportion of harvest by wave across the states. So the rows should sum to 100, but may not exactly due to rounding. So harvest by wave and state can give insight into the impacts of seasonal closures. And as you can see, this proportion does differ across the states, with some states harvesting the majority of their scup in one wave, while other states harvest scup more evenly across multiple waves. So because of this, coastwide closures by wave at the federal level may not be the most appropriate way to reduce harvest and were not recommended by staff. A coastwide closure would not apply harvest reductions equitably across the states. However, seasonal closures on the state level could be a useful tool for states to achieve reductions. Next slide, please. So another way for potential reductions would be a reduction of the federal bag limit. And so this table shows predicted percent change in total harvest under various bag limits based on MRIP estimates from 2018 to 2020. And this calculation assumes a reduction in state and federal waters. And major changes in the bag limit would be needed to notably reduce coastwide harvest because most anglers do not take the full bag limit. So for example, changing the bag limit from 50 fish to 25 fish in state and federal waters would only result in an estimated 3% decrease in total harvest. In addition, stakeholders have expressed concerns about bag limit reductions disproportionately impacting the for-hire sector. So for example, for-hire captains can benefit from advertising the ability to retain the full bag limit, even if customers do not succeed in reaching the limit on each trip. And changing the federal bag limit was not recommended because bag limit decreases may be more appropriate on a state-by-state basis, where they may also choose to break this down by mode. So currently, several states have a bonus wave for the party charter sector with a higher bag limit, and states could consider how best to adjust these seasonal limits. Next slide, please. And then lastly, we have minimum size considerations. And based on the 2018 to 2020 MRIP data, increasing the minimum size coastwide in state and federal waters to 10 inches total length would result in an estimated reduction of up to 33% in total scup harvest. So in the staff recommendation memo, it was recommended that if reductions to federal measures are deemed necessary, staff recommend that this increase in minimum size to 10 inches. This would be to make an initial reduction to harvest, and coastwide harvest could be further reduced to achieve the 56% through changes to state waters measures so that states would have flexibility to achieve the reduced harvest through combinations of bag size and season that may better suit their needs. And then these further reductions would be decided through the commission process in early 2022. Next slide, please. So the monitoring committee met on November 10th and discussed all of these considerations outlined in the staff recreational measures memo. And the monitoring committee members agreed with the projection methodology of using a multi-year average, but they were not comfortable with recommending a 56% reduction in harvest described in the staff memo. So they discussed the socioeconomic repercussions of these cuts and that scup biomass is still nearly double the target level. And some monitoring committee members initially discussed that status quo recreational measures may be appropriate for a third year due to the high biomass, and given that final action on those important ongoing council and board actions are expected in the near future. And once those actions are completed, the monitoring committee might have more clarity on the path forward for management measures. However, the monitoring committee also discussed that given the large discrepancy between recent harvest and the RHL, there would likely still be a need for recreational harvest reductions under various outcomes of these actions. Next slide, please. The monitoring committee was also concerned about the record low recruitment of 2019. So ultimately, the monitoring committee did feel there was a need for some reduction in harvest. And they discussed that the increase in minimum size coastwide has the added benefit of allowing more fish to reach maturity in this time of low recruitment. So they ultimately recommended increasing the minimum size by 1 inch in state and federal waters. And they specified that this recommendation would mean that certain shore programs and southern states would move from an 8-inch minimum size to a 9-inch minimum size total length, while federal waters and northern states would move from 9 inches to 10 inches total length. Next slide, please. So the AP met in November to discuss these recommendations and 2022 recreational measures. And overall, multiple advisors commented that they would prefer this monitoring committee recommended minimum size increase over any other changes to bag size and season. And one advisor from New Jersey added that a bag limit reduction was definitely not preferred. Another advisor noted that from a charter boat perspective, minimum size increase is preferred. One advisor supported the minimum size increase in order to move the harvest closer to the RHL and decrease the harvest of immature fish. And one advisor asked for a comparison of the percent of scup that are mature at 9 inches compared with 10 inches and thought that would be helpful for the council and board meeting. So staff worked with NIMS to provide that information, and it is in a backup slide if folks want to see it. And then one advisor disagreed with the minimum size increase and said the minimum size should be lowered in order to decrease discards. Next slide, please. So multiple advisors also voiced frustration with the use of MRIP data in management and felt that the estimates were unrealistic. Specifically, one advisor added that in Long Island Sound, the fishing days were reduced due to bad weather and a lot of freshwater input. So this led to fewer opportunities for anglers, and he felt that because of this, regulations should be liberalized. And then comments received from an advisor over the phone were that the Magnuson-Stevens Act doesn't address how to deal with a pandemic. And these are catastrophic times that should be factored into management. We don't have the ability to do things a business as usual, and status quo is the best thing we can do for stability in the fisheries. Next slide, please. And then staff also discussed the low recruitment based on the most recent stock assessment and asked advisors what trends they were seeing on the water. One recreational advisor said that earlier in the year, Scup seemed to be more out to the east and they have had to travel further offshore to reach them, but they have still been abundant. Another advisor said that the first wave of Scup seemed to start earlier and move off earlier, but it was a larger run of fish. And then they also noted that at this time of year, wind patterns can disperse the Scup pretty easily. And then another advisor added that the NEMAP survey has seen consistent recruitment across the survey range. Next slide, please. So the decision point is to adopt recreational measures for Scup. This is my last slide. So the first bullet on the screen is the current measures. And then the second bullet outlines the monitoring committee recommendation of increasing the minimum size by 1 inch in state and federal waters. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Carson, for your presentation. Let me see if there are any questions by members of the board or the council at this time. If you can raise your hand, call on you for questions. David Borden.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Sound good, David. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I'm just wondering when should we expect the 2019 year class to manifest itself in the fishery, or is it already in the, or elements of it already in the fishery? Thank you.
Carson.
Yeah, so I believe about 2 to 3 years after the year class is when it usually, we should be starting to see it in 2021 and more so in 22.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Shanna? Wait, I'm sorry, Shanna. Let me go to, my screen's off here. Somebody just dropped off. I'm sorry. Let's go to, Shanna, go ahead, Shanna. And I'll see what happens here. Somebody's thing's moving around. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a question regarding the 33% decrease. I noticed that in the monitoring committee memo and in their recommendations, they recommended dropping most states down all by an inch. But then I also noted in the memo that was provided by staff that in order to achieve that 33% decrease, you actually had to go up to a 10-inch minimum size. So I was just wondering what the discrepancy was there. It seemed interesting to me that the 33% decrease can be achieved through a 1% increase in minimum size, but then in the staff memo, it said you could get the 33% decrease by using a 10-inch minimum size, which would mean 2 inches for some states.
Yeah, so the states that have an 8-inch minimum size collectively make up about 0.1% of the Scup recreational harvest. So allowing that to stay 8 inches doesn't really have that much effect, or move up to 9. And then for those specific shore programs, they were hard to analyze because there's regular shore mode and a shore program within a state. So those were assumed. Basically, we had to make the same assumption between the monitoring committee recommendation and the staff recommendation.
Okay, thank you. Adam Nowalski.
Thank you very much. So one of the earlier slides indicated that neither the rec commercial reallocation nor the recreational reform was going to be done for 2022 management. And I recognize that's because the rulemaking would not be complete. One of the justifications I believe we've used for status quo in recent years, however, was because the rec commercial reallocation was in progress. We had seen options, we had documents before us. The stock status showed a different picture, I think, a couple years ago, including just coming off a very high recruitment event. A biomass that hadn't started the declining trend that we're seeing right now. What I'm interested in knowing, whether staff knows or whether they've had discussions with the service or leadership has, is where we are with rec commercial reallocation that we hope to have a decision later today, where we are with rec reform, while we know final rulemaking wouldn't be completed in 2022. We have a document with proposed options before us. We hope to send that out to the public earlier this year, early in 2022. So would the service consider all of those elements during 2022 rec measures rulemaking with whatever we decide today? And I don't know if leadership's had that discussion. I don't know if staff is. I don't know if the service is prepared to weigh in directly, but I'm wondering what role, even though we don't have final rulemaking done on those actions, what might they play in the consideration of 2022 rec measures rulemaking?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that question, Adam. And you know, I have spoken with Mike Petney. I'm not going to speak for Mike. I think what we should anticipate is that for 2022, the harvest control rule and the allocation alternatives that we'll be discussing later this afternoon would not apply until 2023. So in moving forward with 2022, we need to be comfortable where we stand today as far as putting those measures forward. How the service would consider that is a question for the service, and I will ask whether or not somebody from Garfo would like to speak to that question directly. I see Mike Pentney's hand up, so I'm going to turn to Mike at this time. Go ahead, Mike.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the question. I think, so there's kind of two questions there. What's the potential influence of the decisions we expect to make later today regarding the allocation amendment, which, you know, to my understanding, the plan, at least for the recent period, has been that the allocation amendment would be implemented in for January 1st, 2023, so as to not affect the quota share allocations in 2022, which the council has already taken final action on, and which we, you know, a final rule is imminent for us. So, you know, given that those circumstances, the decision later today on the allocation amendment would have no bearing on 2022, as the allocation change won't go into effect until 2023. As to the recreational reform initiative and the framework adjustment that is to be considered next year, I think everybody around the table knows that, you know, we've been pushing pretty strongly to make meaningful progress on that action as soon as possible. We're not where we would like to be on that. Ideally, we would have a final rule, you know, in 2022 that could inform our decision on the rec measures. That is not going to happen given the current timeline. I would, you know, I've said this to a couple of people. Had the council been able to take final action on the rec reform initiative, such that we know what the council is going to submit and that what we are going to do secretarial review on and rulemaking on, that could potentially have informed our decisions on the 2022 recreational measures. But as I understand the current timeline, that will not be possible. So given that, the rec reform initiative and the decisions to come on that action will also have no bearing on the 2022 rec measures. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Follow up, Adam.
Just to make sure what I heard correctly was that the current timeline would have no bearing on the service's 2022 recreational rulemaking. But does that suggest that if the council and the board was able to find some way to move that timeline up, make a final decision prior to rulemaking on the 2022 rec measures, if we were to somehow be able to move up rec reform to make a decision, I understand rulemaking wouldn't be done, that takes time. But if we made a decision in April on that action instead of the current timeline of June, would the service be able to consider that? Not that they're committed to anything, but as long as we got final action done at the board and council prior to final rulemaking being completed, could the service consider that for 2022 rec measures?
Thanks for the question, Adam. Mike?
Yes.
Okay, that was direct. Now that, and we have discussed, I have discussed with the leadership of the council and the board, as well as the commission, the possibility of moving up that timeline. And there are some, if that is something that we want to have a discussion about today, we're going to dance a kind of a fine line as far as that discussion goes. It was not announced as being part of any type of decision making at this time, but I'll leave it out there. Adam, you brought up the point about, you know, accelerating the timeline on the harvest control rule, and that's in play if we want to have a discussion on that at some point during our debate over these measures. Thanks. Bill Hyatt, you're next.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering if staff could talk just a bit more about the risk to the stock that they've alluded to a couple of times. And what I'm particularly looking for is if you could go a little deeper into the recruitment issue. You know that recruitment has been lower. We know that 2019 has been particularly bad, but I'm kind of looking for some discussion or some information on the, you know, confidence in the data and the confidence in the meaning of the data and the implications for management going forward. If you can share a little more on that, it would be appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is Carson. Stephen, if you could go to slide 29. I have a graph from the most recent stock assessment, and it shows recruitment and spawning stock biomass. So we're looking at 2017 through 2019, lower than average recruitment, 2019 the lowest on record, and then we look at the biomass trends, which is the solid line, and it is trending down. However, it is well above the target, so we do expect that to trend down. Sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. Okay, I'll stay a little further away. So I mean, I think that I think the confidence in the data is something for everyone to decide, but this is kind of indicative that biomass is projected to decline. And then we don't know. So there haven't been ABC overages in recent years. However, there's a chance that the commercial industry could meet their full quota, harvest their full quota, and then that paired with an RHL overage could lead to overages that we tend to avoid.
Are you okay with that, Bill?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Chairman Reed. Eric, you're on mute. If you can unmute yourself, be helpful. There you go.
Thanks, Mike. To Mr. Nowalski's question and Mr. Pentney's response, I'd just like to point out that Magnuson is pretty clear, and it states that basically you can't take action in the present based on actions that may or may not occur in the future, period. So this discussion of perhaps doing this and doing that is not in play, according to Magnuson. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Are there any other board members or council members that have a question at this time? Nicola Meserve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just hoping staff or maybe the service could address like the unknown of the 2020 dead discard estimates and a timeline for that, and when we might be looking at having the ACL evaluation done, and whether there might be anything in play for next year related to that.
Yeah, I personally haven't heard when we will receive those 2020 dead discard estimates, so would look to the service if there's a methodology being developed for that.
Yeah, thanks, Carson. I'll ask if there's somebody from the service. I believe that Richard Cody might be online with us today, or maybe Dr. Hare from the Science Center. Anyone out there would like to offer some thoughts on Nicola's question? Richard Cody, go ahead, Richard.
So hopefully you can hear me. Can you hear me okay?
You're a little faint. If you can speak up or get a little closer to your microphone, that would be helpful. Thanks.
I'll try this. Well, I can only speak to the MRIP data in terms of 2020 estimates. I can't speak to dead discard estimates. But we will be revisiting the 2020 estimates at the end of this year, once we have a full year of 2021 data. The idea would be that we would incorporate two different approximate years for the imputation process. So as you remember, the previous one used 2018 and 2019 data. So 2019 obviously is more approximate than 2018, so it's preferable to look at 2021 as well. So, you know, we would visit that as quickly as we could at the end of this year, and I would expect that, you know, evaluations would be done in time to release the 2021 estimates and revisions to 2020 as necessary by the usual deadline of mid-April.
Does that help, Nicola?
It does on that aspect. I just, what is what's the normal timeline where we're looking at the ACL evaluation? Is it this time of year? And And are we instead using 2017 to 2019 to know if there's a need for any accountability measure in 2022?
Parson?
Yeah, so at the council, we don't calculate that official ACL evaluation. In our staff memo, we looked at 2017 through 2019 to say that it didn't look like an AM would be triggered. However, I would look to the service on the official ACL AM triggering.
Okay, I'll wait to see if somebody from the service raises their hand. But in the meantime, we are at the point, well, okay, I'm sorry. I have Jeff Kalin with his hand up. Jeff, did you have a question? Okay, come on up to the public mic.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board and the council. I'm Jeff Kalin with Lund's Fisheries in Cape May, New Jersey. And for the last 18 months or so, I've become a member of the New Jersey Marine Fisheries Council. So I'm focused a little more on recreational issues than I have been historically. And I have a question about the fecundity of the 18-inch fish, if I could, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Carson. Before I do that, I wanted to say that several months ago when we were doing the commercial specs, and over the last 6 months, we've been pursuing an MSC certification of the Scup fishery. We've been selling frozen Scup into the grocery stores for a number of years and ramping up our productivity, and the markets are increasing. And we came here, if you remember, council at that time and asked to reduce the minimum fish size for Scup from 19 to 18 commercially. So I am curious, Carson, I couldn't find the slide you mentioned about the fecundity at size, or at age rather, excuse me, at size. So do you have that data? Because I think, you know, with the recruitment declining, increasing the minimum size, well, you know, might have demonstrable effect. I think we learned a few months ago when we were in here about going to 18 inches on the commercial side, that although several years ago they were fecund, probably when the stock was ramping up, when it leveled out, it turned out, you know, when you had a density effect, maybe that they were recruiting at an earlier age. So what is do you have that data, the 18 and 19?
So the slide number is 34, Stephen. And so at a total length of 8 inches converted from fork length, the percent mature is 57%. And then at 9 inches total length, 84%, 10 inches, 98% mature. And this was from Mark Tercero at the Science Center.
Yeah, I didn't remember the 8 inches being as high because we tried to get to 8 commercial side, but I think this is a good motion, a good recommendation because of the sensitivity of the declining recruitment of the stock. So thanks for letting me ask that question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Jeff. Excuse me. Greg DiDomenico?
Good morning, Mike. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Greg, go ahead.
Excellent. Would it be possible to get a clarification from the agency on the administrative aspect of considering the possible or pending outcome of a framework? That be okay?
Yeah, do you have a specific question for the agency?
I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering if the outcome of the harvest control rule via a framework, what else would that apply to? Would that apply to an amendment? Would that apply only if you were doing framework? Does that apply with anything else other than this particular circumstance? Thank you.
I'll turn maybe to Mike Pentney. Mike, and I saw your hand up also when Jeff Kalin was speaking. So if you have any thoughts on either question, that'd be great. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. I put my hand up before you called on Greg to try to respond to Nicola's question about the ACL accounting process, but I'll pick that up after I address Greg's question. Yeah, I think I'll channel our friends in General Counsel office, and the clearest answer I can give to Greg's question is it depends. And I recognize that's not very clear. Let me try to expand upon my earlier statements regarding the potential influence the rec reform initiative framework might have. And I want to be really clear on this. I'm speaking to the notion that the council takes final action, including a vote to submit a completed action with all recommended measures to the agency, and that is done and dusted before the agency has made a final decision on a pending regulation. What we would look at in that circumstance, if the council's recommendation, let's take two different examples. The council later today intends to take final action on the allocation amendment. But it's been clear through the development of that action, as I stated, that the intent is for that action to be implemented as part of the January 1, 2023 specifications process, and then moving forward. So any action that the council takes today on that action would not influence a decision that we would make for 2022 because it's not intended for the action to influence 2022. Contrast that with the potential action that the council may be taking in the spring regarding the Recreational Reform Initiative. If the council intends for the Recreational Reform Initiative framework adjustment to be implemented during the 2022 fishing year, and the council has taken final action on that and intends to submit that for secretarial review and rulemaking, shortly thereafter, if we have not made a decision on the 2022 recreational measures yet for the final rule, we would not want to impose regulations through that rulemaking that would compromise or undermine the council's intent with regards to implementation of the Recreational Reform Initiative, provided that we analyze and consider the implications of A, deferring action on that, or what if we disapprove the action? What would the harm to the would there be any harm to the stock? So we would look at a variety of factors to determine whether the council's final action on a framework adjustment to be implemented in a current fishing year could influence the pending decision on a final rule. The outcome of that analysis might be the council's final action has no influence, and we would act as if the council did not take final action on the framework adjustment. But it could also influence the action, and we could decide to, avoid taking action, as I said, that would compromise or undermine the intent of the council action. I hope that somewhat clarifies, although I recognize it's still somewhat confusing because there's a lot of it depends and a variety of factors in my response. But that's what I was trying to get at. But it all hinges on the council having taken final action before we make a decision on a rule. We can't, any potential future action, well, we've got a range of alternatives. We kind of know what the council might do at a future, future meeting. That alone would not have any influence on a regulatory action. And I'll pause there just to see if I've addressed Greg's question or if there's any follow-ups before I try to respond to Nicola's question about the ACLs.
There is, Mike, Mr. Chairman, may I please just ask one or two more questions? Clarification.
Go ahead.
Mike, while this is being contemplated at the time that these decisions are made, do you think we'll have MRIP estimates from 2020, including discards? And where will we be on 2021 estimates when this situation is being acted upon?
So, yeah, I'll try to respond to those. Thanks, Mr. Chairman and Greg. We have 2020 estimates right now. Richard Cody's on the line. He may be able to clarify. There is, I believe what the MRIP team is doing is, they've got 2020 estimates that imputed where there were missing data or missing data from waves and states. They imputed those estimates using 2018, 2019 data. I believe what they are intending to do as the 2021 data are fully in place is look at replacing those 2018 where 2018 and 2019 were used to impute 2020. They're looking at replacing the 2018 with the 2021 to see if it has any effect, and if it does have an effect, whether make a decision as to whether the new imputation that uses the 2021 data provides a more robust, reliable estimate. But Richard is probably the best one to make sure that I didn't just completely screw that up. So we have 2020 estimates, as I understand it. We also have 2020 estimate of discards, which, granted, it's a proxy, but we do have a number, and that's what I was going to use to respond to Nicola's question. In terms of when we would have the 2021 end of year complete estimates, that's typically in the spring of 2022. But again, I can't exactly speak to that because it's the MRIP team's timeline that would generate those numbers.
Thank you, Mike. And just in closing, I would also ask, while you contemplate whether or not this can be done via consulting with your legal counsel, I would also ask that if you were able to consider other framework or other circumstances where this might help or this might be applied to a commercial situation. Perhaps if we had an overage, could we also sort of consider future rulemaking so we don't have to have punitive regulations on us in a particular year, or perhaps even expand that to things like future quota setting, bycatch issues, ESA and MMPA issues. It would be good to know if we could be not just treated the same way in this particular circumstance, but also be helped greatly by future action instead of current action. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Julia, I saw your hand go up. Did you have something you wanted to add to the discussion?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to talk about the timing of final action on the Recreational Reform Initiative Harvest Control Rule Framework and Addendum. And there is a backup slide in Carson's presentation that's titled Harvest Control Rule FW/Addendum, but I'm not sure what number it is, Stephen.
37.
So I'm one of the staff leads for that action, and Savannah's the staff lead for the commission side. And I am a little concerned about the idea that the council and policy board, so this is going through the policy board. They're not here today. We weren't planning to present on any of this in detail, but we had this as backup just in case. So I'm concerned about the idea that the council and policy board might be ready to take final action in April, because the current plan that you can see on the slide here is for June. So we still need to have the council and policy board approve a final range of alternatives and approve a draft document that'll go out for public hearings through the process, have, FMAT and AP meetings on it. And I also wanted to say that for Scup specifically, we don't have, some of you might be aware that we have these 2 recreational fishery models that have been developed for summer flounder, that we are hoping that we can use those models to help us think about what might the management measures be under any of the alternatives in the harvest control rule. But those models are furthest along for summer flounder. The summer flounder version of the model that's being developed through the MSE, my understanding is that that version of the model won't be finalized until June of this year. And there's been no progress on that model or the other model related to Scup. And there's a lot of details left to figure out in terms of how exactly are we going to set the management measures under any of the harvest control rule frameworks and an addendum. And that'll be even more challenging since we don't have this model available for Scup. So I just want to set expectations that I think it would be very challenging to for the council and policy board to feel ready to take final action on this in April as opposed to June. And I'm also concerned about how that might play into any decisions that need to be made today, because I think there's still a lot of uncertainties in what exactly any of the alternatives in this second action would mean for management measures. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Julia. Mike Petney, your hand's still up. Did you still have something you wanted to offer?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I never got a chance to fully address Nicola's question about the AM accounting or the ACL accounting. And so I'm just pulling something up. So we don't have a direct estimate, but as I understand it, we have a proxy that was generated for 2020 recreational dead discards. In numbers of fish, the estimate that we received was roughly 1.9 million fish. Applying the 2019 mean weight provided an ad hoc estimate of 521 metric tons of dead discards in 2020. Normally, we send the council a letter with the full accounting of this for the 3 species. We're still working out a couple of issues related to black sea bass, and that's what has delayed that letter. We have the numbers for fluke and scup, but just not black sea bass yet.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay, so in the interest of time, I think what would be best at this point is to move forward with some direction on a motion that we can discuss. I will ask maybe Bob Beal, put him on the spot a little bit about this discussion of the harvest control rule. Julia pointed out that it is, it's the policy board and the council are the 2 groups that have been working on that rule. And do you think that there could be some time dedicated at the January meeting of the policy board to discuss, next steps moving forward and whether or not it's even a possibility to finalize a action in time for any influence on the 2022 measures?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We haven't finalized the agenda for the January meeting, so we could add some time there. The meeting's pretty full, but we could add some time. But with that said, I think it's important to remember a number of things that Julia said on the timeline. Now, there's a lot of staff work that has to be done between now and then, and been trying to do the mental gymnastics to figure out how we get from where we are now and to where we could be in April or in June. So, if one of the things that I've heard comments about, not on the record today, but is potentially kind of paring down the rec reform initiative or taking some options out as far as the harvest control rule goes. And, that could speed up staff time, but, I'm concerned that if we reduce the range of options available, that would that document still really fully reflect the range of things that we'd want to consider? Because the commission still has to go out to public hearing. So, we'd have to meet at the end of January, and then somehow get a document finalized, run around, full suite of public hearings for any state that would want one, and then, summarize that comment and get it ready for a decision in April. So there's a lot of steps there that need to happen. And I think the staff work to get all that done is probably the biggest hurdle that I see in my mind. But we can, if this group and the commission wants to spend some time in January, we can do that. I just worry that even with that time, there's a lot that still needs to happen pretty quickly to get somewhere to be available for a decision point at the April meeting. And then while I'm speaking, I think the almost worst case scenario in my mind might be hurrying something through, making a decision in April, and then not having all the latitude you want to move in April, and then immediately starting a new document to even further develop the harvest control rule down the road. I think that's almost, it's even harder for the public to track what's going on if this is sort of taken in two incremental steps to get, to where we ultimately want to be in rec reform, or where the board may want to be in rec reform.
All right, thanks, Bob. So why don't we commit to this group listening in today and here at the table to maybe have a discussion with leadership from the, with the commission and the council, and decide how we want to play that out with the policy board at the upcoming January meeting, whether it's worth the time spent to have that discussion there or not. We can get back to everybody that's participating today on any action there, so that they can follow along if they so choose, depending on that decision. So, okay, with that said, I appreciate your thoughts, Bob, but I would like to move on to a motion for debate. We have a monitoring committee recommendation, and there is a motion drafted for the monitoring committee recommendation. If there is any appetite around the table or folks participating virtually to make that motion on behalf of either the board or the council, now's the time. We can have that put up on the screen. So I'll ask for any hands for anyone that would like to make a motion regarding the monitoring committee recommendation. Adam Nowalski.
I will make a motion, Mr. Chairman, on behalf of the board and the council for a 1-inch minimum size in. I'll go ahead and read it. Move to increase the Scup recreational minimum size by 1 inch in state and federal waters. The 1 inch would be applied to existing 2021 state measures, which vary by state and mode. In federal waters, this results in a 10-inch total length minimum size for Scup. It's not in the written as provided, but I think I would like to add, if it accurately reflects the discussion, that this would be an approximately 33% reduction.
Yeah, so we can do that, Adam, if that's your pleasure. And I'll just ask staff to add something there, achieving an approximate 33% reduction. Okay. How does that read, Adam? To your liking?
Well, I'll get to the liking part of it, Mr. Chairman, maybe in a couple moments after I get a second, but it's satisfactory. Thank you.
I expected that, Adam. Thank you. And thanks for making the motion. Let me ask for any member of the council that would like to second that motion. Can you do so by raising your hand? Paul Reese is going to second that motion on behalf of the council. And for the board, I have David Borden. Okay, go ahead, Adam. You want to provide some rationale?
I will provide rationale. Again, want and like here, I find myself in a very difficult position. We have a biomass that, while it's clearly showing a decreasing trend, it's decreasing to 200% of our target. So even the fact that it's decreased if it levels off somewhere there, or even in another 25% drop from where it is, a 50% drop from where it is, we're still exceeding our target. This is a very healthy resource, and that needs to be our starting point for deliberations here. With what the staff put together, we had the conversation, our last agenda item about Fluke, that previous processes might have called for an 81% liberalization. We settled on something much lower, and I supported the concept of mitigating the impacts of MRIP and how we respond to it. So I think this is a very similar mindset. We're taking something where as a starting point, we've got potentially a 56% decrease. My element of wanting here, calling for a 33% recreational decrease on a species that's at 200% of a biomass. I don't know if I'm going to get out of my car in one piece at home when I get home, quite frankly. I don't know what'll be waiting for me. I'm going to say I think the recreational sector will be a little bit kinder to me than that, hopefully. But I think that this is consistent with mitigating our response to MRIP. I think this is responsive to biological indicators we're seeing, particularly with concerns about recruitment. I think we have to make a decision today, not dependent on the harvest control rule possibly doing something to help us, but knowing that the service is willing to consider that moving forward. Maybe they feel differently when they make final rulemaking if we are able to move forward. I'll say that I think it's incumbent upon us, and I'm fully committed to working with leadership and staff to finding some way to move harvest control rule final action timeline up. We made commitments to that, as the regional administrator indicated. We've had that in our intent that we've publicly offered for quite some time, with the intention to complete it for use in 2022. So I think that's consistent. So again, my want and my like of this motion notwithstanding, I think it's appropriate today. I think it's consistent with the last discussion we have, and that's my rationale for me.
Okay, thanks, Adam. I'll turn to Paul Reese. If you had anything you would like to add, Paul?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just on top of what Adam said, once again, there are a lot of these fish, and it would be really nice to maintain the availability. It takes a lot of pressure off of other species in the Northeast. And it's a very popular fish with a lot of people that don't have access to other fisheries.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, I'll go to the seconder for the board, David Borden. Do you have anything in addition to Adam and Paul's comments that you'd like to add at this time, David?
Yes, please, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me? I just want to check.
Sound good.
Okay, so I seconded it for the reason that I think it's a means for us to move forward here, and I view it as a compromise. I also am opposed to bag limit changes for the reasons that have been noted by the for hire sector. I think it's a lot easier to use minimum size changes so that they can recruit people to recruit people to fish on their boats. I realize it's not up to the standard of a 55%, 56% cut, but it is quite a ways forward. And I although it's not part of our measures in the plan, I just note if you look at the NOAA website in terms of the commercial catch to date, it's going to be about 10 million pounds behind. So there are some buffers and some parameters that are both pro and con. So I think it's a compromise, and I think it's a way forward. So that's the reason I seconded it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, David. Further discussion of the motion. Nicola Meserve? Or Adam, before I go to you, Nicola, let me go to Adam first.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point about the way the motion is worded here upon rereading it. If I recall the staff presentation, the 10-inch change in minimum size in federal waters, was that a 28% reduction, I thought? But then when the monitoring committee met and across the board, 33% reduction was achieved with that 1 inch increase overall. I just want to make sure we get this right, because I think the 1 inch federal waters was not exactly 33%, but when we said 1 inch across the board, everything by all modes, that was 33%. Just want to make sure we get it right here.
Carson.
So the staff recommendation was a 10-inch change for both state and federal waters across the board. And the monitoring committee recommendation was a little bit different of a 1-inch increase, but because of how small the southern states that have an 8-inch minimum size makeup of harvest, it came out to the same percent reduction. And given the assumptions that we have to do, we can't parse out the MRIP data within one state within shore mode at two different, like an 8-inch and a 9-inch minimum size. So they were both the same percent reduction.
So I'm hearing that the motion as written is technically correct. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Nicola Mazur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we have a lot of reasons from the last 2 years that we were able to support status quo that are still in place, including the ongoing allocation amendment and the harvest control rule, high stock size, and the negative socioeconomic impacts that would have been taken. All of those are still in play. However, I am swayed by some of the staff's points that some action is needed today, including that as we look at the possible outcomes of the allocation amendment, we're still observing harvest levels that are above the projected RHLs that may come into play in 2023 under a change in the allocations. And it was only a couple years ago, prior to 2018, that the northern region was at a 10-inch size limit, and that was, made possible. The 9-inch size limit was made possible by the strength of the 2015 year class, which has been subject to high fishing pressure for several years now, and has been followed by poor recruitment. So I don't think this is an unreasonable step to take a cut to move us somewhere in the middle of the status quo and then the 56% reduction. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola. Mike Petney.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I mean, this is, this is a really difficult spot to be in. I don't disagree with any of the comments, remarking on the fact that this is a very robust stock. Biomass is high. Recognizing there are some questions around recruitment and size of maturity that I think we need to look into. But the regulations are what they are, and the regulations require the council to develop and recommend measures to ensure that the recreational harvest limit is not exceeded and that we don't exceed the recreational ACL. We have the information in front of us that in order to do that, we need a 56% reduction in harvest, not a 33% reduction. So to, paint this as a compromise, that may be so, in that it's between status quo and the full reduction that's necessary, but the regs don't authorize us to make a compromise. The regs require us to take the full reduction. And so I oppose the motion. I hope the council opposes this motion and, puts something in place that achieves the full reduction that's necessary, either through a combination of bag or season changes. And I'll just note that in addition to the council's obligation under the regs to develop the measures, if the council fails to do that, The regulations are even more clear on my responsibility. And I'll read the sentence in the regulations. If the regional administrator determines that additional recreational measures are necessary to ensure that the sector ACL will not be exceeded, he will publish a proposed rule in the Federal Register to implement additional management measures for the recreational fishery. So that's the regulation that I have to follow. There's no parenthetical or comma that says, you know, unless the stock is really good. It's a straight up period. So that's the regulation that I have to follow, and that's the regulation I intend to follow. Now with Scup in particular, it's really tricky because of the small amount of harvest that comes from federal waters. So I don't know what additional measures we will have in our toolbox to make up the difference if this motion passes and this becomes the recommendation of the council. We could be looking at a closure of the EEZ for federal permit holders as the best that we can do. I hope that we don't have to go there, but I want everybody around the table who has to vote on this motion to be aware of the implications because they are significant. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to go next to Bill Hyatt. Bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am speaking in support of this motion, not just because it's a compromise, but because it's a wise compromise. In this state, in this case, the abundance of the stock gives us time to be pragmatic and not overly reactionary. And I think it's important, given the abundance of this stock, it's important to the public that we act in a manner that's wise and not overly reactionary. And I don't know, I see sufficient justification in the information that's been presented to support this proposal, again, based largely on where the stock stands at the moment. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Tom Foti?
Yeah, we wonder why the public out there does not have trust in the system. And here's a perfect example. Years ago, we actually took, without justification, recreational quota away from us. And this was not because of any data that said we could do it. We just did it. The NIMS approved that, the council approved it, and the commission, even over my objection many years ago, just because we were going to do it. So we should have had a larger quota to begin with, but there was arbitrary decisions made by the council, the commission, and NIMS at that time. We are now sitting here understanding that it was wrong, understanding that we should have had a higher quota based on really what the MRAP's numbers are, and yet you still want to penalize the recreational community. And this is what I always say, we're managing by lawsuits, not what is common sense. And we basically need to understand that this sends such a horrible message to the recreational sector out there. And I can't justify it. I can't basically go to the people I represent, both commercial and recreational, and talk about how this is fair, this is honest. And, I understand that, we supposedly, the council is different rules and regulations by the commission, but this is one of the problems we run into all the time. And just to say, because it is, you're going to make fishermen suffer up and down the coast. Well, that's not a good way to manage. We're putting undue pressure, undue economic impact, and undue frustration on the recreational sector. And you wonder why they do not support the council system, and we've lost their trust anymore over the years. And this is one of the reasons why. I can't blame them.
Okay, thanks for your comments, Tom. We are, just a time check for everyone, we are kind of bumping up against our allotted time for this agenda item. I have a couple more hands. I'm going to take those hands. We'll take a moment to caucus, and then we'll call the question on the motion before us. David Borden, you're next, and then I have Eric Reed and Joe Cimino. Then we'll take up the question. Go ahead, David.
I'm going to pass, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to get some clarification on Mr. Pentney's last statement. about closing the EEZ to federal permit holders. I mean, we're talking about rec measures. Is that comment saying you're going to close it to commercial fishing as well? You have the possibility of closing it to the commercial fishery as well.
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Head Mike.
Sorry, no, not, there was no intention to suggest that we would close the fishery to commercial fisheries. It was more focused on the implications for the federally permitted for hire sector that that would be most most affected by a federal EEZ closure of the recreational fishery.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Hope that helps answer your question, Eric. Last, Joe Semino. Go ahead, Joe.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Here as a council and commission member, and I'll have to see where we are as a voting member of the board. But as a council member, I'm concerned because I'm expecting this to result in a federal waters closure, and I really don't know what that means for our constituents, and so it's going to be a very difficult decision for me as a council member. But I ask all of you then to give this more consideration. If you think that impact is something that you can't handle, then consider putting another option on the table.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Why don't we take 3 minutes to caucus with our states, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to the board they're going to take up the question first in this case. Thanks. 3 minutes.
The caucus. So Peter and Joe and Stakeholder. We won't get. Second guess myself. I feel good, but then I go walking.
Tom Fody, your mic isn't muted. I just wanted to let you know.
Sorry.
Does anybody need additional time to caucus? We do? Okay. Yeah, we'll give another minute or so. Okay, thanks. Okay, it looks like the states have had time to caucus, and I'm going to turn the floor over to my co-chair to call the question of the board. Justin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we get started, I'll go ahead and read the motion into the record. Move to increase the Scup recreational minimum size by 1 inch in state and federal waters. The 1 inch increase would be applied to existing 2021 state measures, which vary by state and mode. In federal waters, this results in a 10-inch total length minimum size for Scup, achieving an approximate 33% reduction in harvest. This time, I'll ask all those on the board in favor to raise their hands.
Justin, I'm going to read the states. I have Connecticut, Massachusetts, Maryland, New Jersey, Rhode Island, and New York.
Okay, thanks. Can we clear the hands, Tony? Great. All those opposed?
I have NOAA fisheries in North Carolina.
Okay, thanks. I'll ask if there are any null votes.
I have Delaware and Virginia.
Okay, thanks. And last, I'll ask if there are any abstentions.
I have Potomac River Fisheries Commission.
Okay, thank you. So the motion carries 6 in favor, 2 opposed, 2 null votes, and 1 abstention.
Thanks, Justin. Okay, I'll turn now to the council. Is the council ready for the question? All those members of the council that support the motion, please raise your hand. I have 12 in favor. We can clear the hands, please. All those opposed, same sign. Seven opposed. Any abstentions? Okay. Motion carries the council 12 to 7 to 0. And given that motion carried the board, the motion before us carries. Is there anything else, Carson or Dustin, that needs to come before us at this time regarding Scup?
No, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you for your presentation and time this morning or this afternoon. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and break for lunch. It is almost 12:45. Let's come back in an hour at 1:45, and we'll pick up the discussion on black sea bass. Thank you.